Mercer, I came to talk business. Then talk fast and get off my land. That boy's past isn't as clean as you think.
Keep my brother out of this.
Zeke stays. This ends right here. Mercer, you're making...
He ordered one mail-order bride. What stepped off that stagecoach was 4 broken strangers with nothing but calloused hands and a deal that could collapse any day. Read now to find out what happens when desperate people stop surviving and start building something worth fighting for. The stagecoach was 40 minutes late. Gideon Mercer stood on the warped planks of the Cold Creek Depot platform and watched the dust column rising in the south. He'd been watching it for the last quarter mile. Out here, a man learned to read the land the way others read a newspaper. Dust column that tall, that wide, something heavier than a single coach, was pushing hard through the flats. He pulled his watch from his vest pocket. 2:15. He'd been standing here since 1:30, with his hat in his hands, which felt ridiculous. But Maeve Holloway was supposed to arrive on the afternoon stage, and he figured a man ought to at least look like he'd made an effort. He put the hat back on. The sun was doing its usual Nevada cruelty, pressing down on the platform like a flat iron. August here wasn't August anywhere else. It was a living thing, deliberate and mean. Gideon had fought the Confederacy through 2 Virginia summers, which he'd thought was punishment enough from God. Then he'd come out west and discovered Nevada had a completely different theology. He looked down at the letter in his hand. He'd read it so many times the fold lines were going white. Dear Mr. Mercer, I am a woman of plain sense and no pretension. I preserve ride and keep books. I will work for what I have and ask the same of those around me. I understand the arrangement. I will honor it. That was essentially the whole letter. Most of the other correspondence from the matrimonial agency had been longer, fuller, more decorated with hopeful language. Maeve Holloway's letter had been 4 sentences and a signature. He'd chosen it over 43 others. A man in his position didn't need decorated language. He needed someone who understood that Red Ridge Ranch was not a comfortable posting. The banknote from Harlan Fitch at Nevada Territorial was due in 11 months, and the condition attached to his loan extension was humiliating, but plain. A settled family demonstrates permanence of investment, Mr. Mercer. A bachelor rancher is a temporary one. So here he was, standing on a depot platform in his cleanest shirt, waiting for a woman he'd never met, so a bank in Carson City would believe he was rooted to the earth and not likely to abandon a failing cattle operation in the middle of the night. The coach swung around the last bend and rattled up to the platform in a tremendous clatter of iron and dust. The driver, a leathery man named Ott, whom Gideon knew distantly from the freighting routes, hauled back on the lines and set the brake with a sound like a gunshot. Mercer, Ott called down, tipping his hat with absolutely no ceremony. Got your package. Gideon let that pass. The coach door opened. A woman stepped down. She was younger than he'd pictured, though he wasn't sure why he'd pictured anything at all. Dark hair pinned back without fuss. A gray traveling dress that had seen better days but was clean and pressed. She was slight, but held herself in a way that took up more space than slight suggested, shoulders squared, chin level. Her eyes found him immediately, the way a person's eyes find the only familiar landmark in a strange town. She didn't smile. He appreciated that. Mr. Mercer, she said, Miss Holloway. He stepped forward to offer his hand. She shook it the way a man shakes a hand, firm and brief. Then she looked back at the coach. Gideon followed her gaze. A man climbed down, broad through the shoulders, but gaunt underneath it, like a frame built for more weight than it currently carried. His skin had that particular gray undertone that Gideon recognized from field hospitals. He moved with the careful deliberateness of someone managing pain they decided not to mention. Then another man, younger, wiry, quick on his feet. He dropped down from the coach step and immediately looked around at the landscape with the alert expression of someone cataloging everything in sight. There was a smear of something mechanical, on the side of his jaw that he hadn't fully managed to wipe away. Then a boy, 15 maybe. One side of his face carried the puckered white signature of a burn that had healed without much medical attention. He looked at the platform, at the street beyond it, at Gideon, and he didn't look frightened. He looked watchful, which was different. His eyes were the sharpest Gideon had seen in a long time. 4 people stood on the platform now. Gideon looked at Maeve Holloway. She looked back at him without flinching. He put the watch in his pocket. He took a slow breath. He kept his voice very even, the way he'd learned to keep his voice in the army when things went sideways, and other men were watching to see how you handled it. "Your letter," he said nothing about brothers. "No," she said. It didn't. The wiry young man was studying the depot's water tower with professional interest, head tilted like he was listening to it. The gaunt one had his eyes on Gideon, watching him the way a man watches another man when he's ready to step in front of someone he loves. The boy stood at Maeve's shoulder without touching her, just present. Gideon turned his back to them. He walked 4 steps to the edge of the platform and looked out at the street, at the dust still settling from the coach's arrival, at the hitching post where his horse stood, tied in the shade of the hardware store awning. He stood there for a moment. Then he came back. "Explain it to me," he said. Maeve nodded once, like she'd been expecting exactly that and had been organizing her thoughts for the last 400 miles. "There was a collapse," she said, "in the number 7 shaft at Dunmore Coal, 3 weeks ago. 14 men died." She paused, not for effect, just because some things require a breath between them. Cormac was inside when it went. He got out. Most of his crew didn't. The broad-shouldered one, Cormac, said nothing. His jaw moved slightly. The company had been underpaying the men. For 11 months, Maeve continued. Shaving the weight counts, docking pay for equipment, the men were buying themselves. When the collapse happened, there were men talking about organizing, about making noise. The company's safety foreman filed reports saying the collapse was caused by unauthorized excavation. He named Cormac as the responsible party. "That's a criminal charge," Gideon said. "It's a lie," she said, "but it's a lie with a company lawyer and a county judge behind it." Gideon looked at Cormac. "You have a warrant?" "Civil, not criminal," Cormac said. His voice was rougher than it should have been for a man his age so far. They were going to make it. "Criminal," Maeve said. "We had 3 days' warning from a clerk who owed Cormac a favor. There was no time to fight it there. We had no money to fight it there." She let that sit for exactly 1 second. "I had a ticket west. It was the only ticket we had. And them," Gideon said, looking at the younger 2. "Zeke's not leaving Cormac," she said. It was stated as plain fact, like the boiling point of water. "And Toby's not leaving any of us." Zeke had turned from the water tower and was listening now. He had the easy posture of someone who expected to work for whatever he got and wasn't embarrassed by the expectation. "There was a petty theft charge," Maeve said, and her voice didn't change when she said it. No softening, no apology. "Zeke, 2 years ago. A coal company commissary." He took food. Gideon looked at Zeke. "Bread and salt pork," Zeke said. "They'd been holding our wages for 6 weeks. The boarding house stopped feeding us." He held Gideon's gaze. "I'd do it again." Gideon didn't respond to that. He looked at the boy. "Toby can't hear you properly," Maeve said. "The left side. The collapse he was outside, but close. Pressure." She touched her own ear briefly. "He reads lips very well. Face him when you speak." Gideon turned to face the boy directly. Toby met his eyes. There was no self-pity in him that Gideon could detect, and he was looking for it out of habit. He'd commanded men who'd been broken by lesser things than what this boy carried on his face. Toby wasn't broken. He was just looking back, calm and careful, waiting to see what kind of man this was going to be. Gideon had not come to the platform prepared for any of this. He'd come prepared for 1 woman, 4 sentences, a firm handshake. He'd come prepared to manage a transaction that would keep the bank off his land for another year, while he figured out if Red Ridge was going to survive. He had one room in the main house that he'd emptied out for her. He had a bunkhouse with 3 rotted boards in the floor that he'd been meaning to fix for a year. He had $46 in cash and a cattle herd that was thinner than he liked. He looked at Toby's burn scars, at Cormac's deliberate, effortful breathing, at the thinness of all of them, the particular thinness of people who've been choosing who eats on a given night for long enough that it stopped feeling like a choice. The fury was there. He didn't pretend it wasn't. He'd made an agreement on certain terms, and those terms were now standing on his depot platform, looking nothing like he'd imagined. A man had a right to be angry about that. He was angry about it. He breathed through it. And then he thought about Harlan Fitch's letter, which he'd also read enough times to know without looking. A settled family, Mr. Mercer. Permanence of investment. Well, here's what I can offer, he said. He addressed all of them. But he looked at Maeve because she was clearly the one who'd negotiated this far and would negotiate whatever came next. Red Ridge runs about 300 head right now, down from 500 2 years ago. There's a main house and a bunkhouse. The bunkhouse needs work. You'll do that work before winter sets in. We'll do it, Maeve said. I need hands who actually work, he said. I can't carry passengers. I don't have the margin for it. Cormac made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Maeve put her hand on his arm without looking at him, and whatever he was going to say didn't get said. I'll make you a proposition, Maeve said, and I want you to hear all of it before you answer. Go ahead. 4 pairs of working hands, she said. 1 full season, April to November. Everything that needs doing: cattle, fence, crop, structure. You get all of it. From all of us. Her voice was level and clear. She wasn't pleading. This wasn't a plea. It was a negotiation between 2 people who understood need and didn't dress it up. In exchange, you give us basic board. Roof, food, heat. That's the whole of it. And at the end of the season, if we haven't pulled our weight, she said, we leave without a dime. Your call. No argument. And if you have, then we talk about what comes next, like people who've earned the right to talk about it. Gideon studied her face. She wasn't looking away. She wasn't performing confidence, she just had it. Or something close enough to it that the difference didn't matter. He looked at her brothers again. Cormac, who was costing himself energy just standing in the heat and refusing to let it show. Zeke, who had gone back to looking at the water tower with that focused, hungry attention. Toby, who had pulled a small stub of pencil from his coat pocket and was making quick marks in the margins of what looked like a folded receipt, glancing between the pencil and the landscape with an expression of genuine pleasure. The boy was drawing, standing on a depot platform in an unfamiliar town with burn scars on his face and his whole life displaced into a single bag. And he was drawing. Gideon made a decision. He didn't announce it as a decision. It was more like he noticed that he'd already made it, somewhere between looking at Cormac's chest and watching Toby's pencil move. The bunkhouse has 4 bunks, he said. Clean bedding. You'll put it on yourselves. There's a stove. The flue needs clearing. He looked at Zeke. That's your first job. Kitchen's in the main house. Miss Holloway will take the loft room. He paused. Meals are at the main house table. All of you. That's not a courtesy. That's a condition of mine. Maeve looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, barely not surprise exactly, but a recalibration of some kind. All right, she said. I'm not running a charity here, he said. You should be clear on that. I wouldn't take charity, she said, and neither would they. I know, he said, and he found, somewhat to his own irritation, that he did know. He'd known it since he read 4 sentences and a signature. He picked up the largest of their bags before anyone could argue about it. It was heavy enough that he understood something more about what these 4 people had decided to carry and what they'd decided to leave behind. My horse is at the hitching post, he said, already moving. Wagons at the livery 2 blocks east. We'll load up and be back at the ranch before dark. He didn't wait to see if they followed. They followed. Ott was still up on the box seat. watching the whole thing with the detached amusement of a man who saw a great deal of human nature on the road and had lost the ability to be surprised by any of it. "Good luck to you, Mercer," he said. Gideon didn't look up. "Mind your lines, Ott." Ott laughed and released his brake, and the stagecoach moved on down the street. At the livery, Gideon backed his wagon out while Maeve organized the loading with no instruction from him and no wasted motion. Cormac and Zeke loaded the bags. Toby held the horse's head without being asked, which told Gideon someone had taught him about horses, or he'd figured it out for himself. The wagon sat 4 in the bed if you didn't mind company, plus the driver's bench. Gideon climbed to the bench. He expected Maeve to climb up beside him. Instead, she climbed into the bed with her brothers. He glanced back once and saw that she had her hand on Cormac's arm again, and this time they were talking quietly, faces close. Whatever they were saying wasn't for him. He turned forward and flicked the lines, and the wagon rolled out of Cold Creek onto the main road heading north. The Nevada landscape opened up around them, the way it always did, without ceremony, without apology. Sage flats reaching out in every direction, broken by the dark shapes of distant ridges. The sky was a particular shade of late afternoon blue that Gideon had come to associate with this place, and no other, the kind of color that showed up between the heat of the day and the cold of the night. Behind him, he could hear Zeke's voice, low, explaining something about the terrain, the way a man talks when he's reading a new place for its practical uses. He heard Maeve respond. He heard Cormac cough once, carefully, the cough of a man who has learned to make himself cough quietly. He drove and didn't turn around. He had not come to the platform prepared for this. But then, he'd not been prepared for a great many things that had happened to him, and he was still here, still driving north, still, for reasons he couldn't have fully explained to Harlan Fitch, or to himself, or to God, pulling toward the work rather than away from it. Red Ridge was 10 miles out. They'd reach it in an hour and a half. It occurred to him, somewhere around the 3rd mile, that his dining table sat 3. He'd built it that way long before he'd written to any matrimonial agency, back when 3 was still a number he set places for, back before the war had made 2 of those places permanent vacancies. He'd need to build a larger table. He cataloged the lumber he had on hand. Pine, mostly some good boards he'd been saving, without a clear purpose. Long enough. He could do it in a day, maybe a day and a half, if he fit it. Between morning chores, he thought about the burn scars on the side of Toby's face, the way the boy looked up at him on the platform, not afraid, just measuring, the way a person looks at something they're trying to understand, not something they're trying to survive. The wagon hit a rut and swayed. "Sorry," Gideon said automatically. "We're fine," Maeve said from behind him. He nodded at nothing in particular and drove on. To the north, the dark line of the Red Ridge rose against the afternoon sky, and below it, though he couldn't see it yet, his ranch sat in the valley between 2 shallow creek draws, struggling and stubborn and still standing. 4 pairs of working hands. He supposed he was about to find out what that was worth. 1 full season. He supposed he was about to find out what a great many things were worth. The wagon moved north through the sage, and the sun came down behind the western ridges, and the sky went from blue to bronze to the particular deep gold that preceded dark. Somewhere in the bed of the wagon, Toby had his pencil out again. Gideon could hear the faint sound of it moving across paper. He didn't ask what the boy was drawing. Some things a man just let be. Red Ridge Ranch announced itself before you could see it. The smell came first, cattle and sage, and the particular sharpness of well water pulled up from deep ground. Then the sound of the windmill, or what had been a windmill, its iron frame visible against the last of the evening sky, standing still when it should have been turning. Then the buildings themselves, coming into view as the wagon crested the low rise above the valley, a main house built from dark timber, solid and plain, a bunkhouse set back and to the east, 2 working sheds, a corral with rough-cut posts. Nothing wasted, nothing decorative, Everything pointed toward function. Maeve took it in from the wagon bed, without comment. Cormac looked at the corral. Zeke looked at the dead windmill. Toby looked at everything. Gideon pulled the wagon around to the side of the main house and set the brake. He climbed down without ceremony. "Main house," he said, gesturing. "Bunkhouse is there. Lamps on the hook inside the door." He carried the heaviest bag to the bunkhouse himself, left it on the floor inside, and came back for the horse. He didn't give a tour. He didn't explain what was where. He unhitched and led the horse to the corral, worked the gate latch, let the animal in. Maeve watched him from the yard. She was going to have to figure this man out. That was plain. He moved like someone who'd organized his life down to the smallest motion and resented anything that disturbed the organization. Everything he did was efficient and a little cold, not cruel cold, but the cold of someone who had learned to keep the temperature down deliberately, the way you bank a fire to make it last. She picked up 2 bags and carried them to the bunkhouse. Inside, 4 bunks, 2 on each side. A cast-iron stove in the corner, the flue showing the dark residue of long disuse. A single window, west-facing. A wooden peg rail along one wall. The floor had 3 boards that moved when you stepped on them, and one that had gone soft with old water damage. "Well," Zeke said, coming in behind her and looking up at the flue with professional disapproval. "It's a roof," Cormac said. "It's a roof," Maeve agreed. Toby went to the window and looked out at the yard, then turned back and held up the stub of pencil from his pocket. He raised his eyebrows at Maeve. She nodded, and he sat down on the nearest bunk and opened his folded receipt to the blank side. Cormac sat down across from Toby carefully, in the deliberate way he sat down everywhere. Now testing first, then committing. The ride had been 10 miles of unpaved road, and it had cost him. He wasn't going to say that. Maeve set down the bags and said, "Zeke, flew first thing tomorrow. Before dawn if you want," Zeke said. He was already studying the stovepipe joint with his head tilted. "Not before dawn, after dawn. Sleep first." She left them and walked to the main house. She knocked. It seemed right to knock, even though she'd been told to come. Even though she'd traveled 1,400 miles to be here. Some habits were worth keeping. The knock was a way of saying, "I know this is your house. I haven't forgotten that." "It's open," Gideon called from inside. The main house was one large room on the ground floor kitchen and sitting area, no wall between them, with a loft accessible by a steep board staircase on the north wall. A stone fireplace on the west side, dark and cold. A table that sat 3, with 3 mismatched chairs. A cast-iron cookstove that was the best thing in the room by some margin. Well-made, well-maintained. Gideon was at the stove, building a fire in it. He didn't turn when she came in. "Lofts. Yours," he said. "There's a cot up there and a trunk. Blankets in the trunk." "Thank you." "Privy's behind the house, east side. Well is 20 yards out the back." "I saw it." He got the fire going and stood up. He looked at her with the particular expression she was coming to recognize. Not unfriendly. Not friendly. Just evaluating. Like a man who spent a lot of time measuring things and had extended that habit to people. "I'll cook for the household," she said. "That should be established now." "All right. I'll need to know what you have in the way of stores." He opened the pantry door beside the stove. She looked. Cornmeal, dried beans, some salt pork, flour, a small tin of coffee, 3 potatoes that were thinking about sprouting. Enough for 1 person, stretched careful. Not enough for 5 without planning. "I'll need to go into town," she said. "We'll go Saturday." "Saturday is 4 days." "I know when Saturday is." She looked at the stores again. "I can work with this for 4 days. But I want to be clear that I'm not serving 4 adults and a growing boy on short rations because the budget's tight. If money's the problem, tell me what the number is and I'll work within it. If the problem is something else, tell me that instead." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you consider short rations?" he asked. "What my brothers have been living on for the last year," she said. "That's short rations. I know what it looks like. I know what it does to people over time, and I'm not watching it happen here." It came out with more heat than she'd intended. Not much more, but some. She held his gaze and didn't walk it back. Gideon looked at the pantry, then at her. Something moved across his face, not quite guilt, not quite discomfort. More like a man who has been living alone long enough that certain things had stopped being visible to him. "I'll add to the stores before Saturday," he said. "There's a supply box I keep in town. I'll send word to have it filled." "That'll do. In the morning, I'll show you where everything is. The root cellar's got more than that pantry." He paused. "I don't always eat much. I may have let things run down." It was about as close to an admission as she suspected he was capable of producing. She accepted it without pressing. "Then we'll bring them back up," she said. "That's all." She climbed the loft staircase. The cot was narrow, and the ceiling came down at an angle, and there was a single small window looking out to the north where the ridge rose dark against the sky. She sat on the edge of the cot for a moment and let herself be still. 1,400 miles, 4 days' warning, 1 bag, 3 brothers, and a ticket bought with the last of the money she'd saved in 18 months of mending and washing and stretching every cent until it near broke. She was here. They were here. It wasn't warm yet, but it was solid. The building didn't move when the night wind came up, and that was more than she could say for the company boarding house in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, which had developed a sway in the northeast corner that everyone pretended wasn't there. She lay down without undressing and was asleep inside of 2 minutes. The next morning, Gideon was up before light. Maeve heard him moving below the stove door, the water pail, boots on the floor. She was used to early rising and didn't fight it. She came down the loft stairs to find him already outside, and she got the stove going and found the oats in the back of the pantry, and had porridge on before the sky was properly gray. Her brothers came across from the bunkhouse when the light came up. Zeke had already cleared the flu somehow. She hadn't heard him. But his hands were black to the wrist, and he smelled like char and old creosote. "You said after dawn?" she said. "It was after dawn," he said. "Barely." Cormac came in and sat down and wrapped both hands around the coffee mug she put in front of him. He looked better than he had last night. Sleep helped him when he could get it, without the coughing breaking through. Toby came in last and went immediately to the window above the kitchen basin and looked out at the morning light on the ridge with the focused attention of someone cataloging information. Then he sat down and they all ate together at the 3-chair table, which required 2 people to eat, standing up until Gideon came in from the barn and looked at the arrangement without comment. Nobody said anything about the chairs. After breakfast, Gideon walked the property with Maeve and showed her the root cellar, which was better stocked than the pantry cured venison, some dried corn, 2 crocks of lard, onions hanging from the ceiling in braided ropes. Then he walked her to the tool shed, the hay barn, the corral. He named things in quantities in short sentences without decoration. She listened and remembered. He was giving her information. That was its own kind of trust, even if he hadn't decided to call it that yet. Cormac spent the morning mending fence along the lower pasture. He didn't ask permission and didn't announce it. He took the tools from the shed and went. Gideon came out of the hay barn an hour later, saw him working the corner post, and watched for a long moment from a distance before going back inside. Maeve saw that happen. She was hanging the morning wash on the line between the house and the first shed. Zeke had introduced himself to the broken windmill by mid-morning. He'd climbed it before she'd even noticed he was gone, and she could hear the intermittent ring of a wrench against iron from wherever she stood in the yard. Toby was inside. She presumed drawing, which was fine. He'd been drawing since he was 7 years old, and it had always served a purpose, even when it didn't look like one. Late in the afternoon, things came to a head. Gideon came into the kitchen while Maeve was starting supper and said, without preamble, "I'll set a plate for you in here. Your brothers can eat in the bunkhouse." She turned from the stove. "No," she said. He stopped. He wasn't used to being told no in his own kitchen. She could see that plainly. "I didn't mean any disrespect," he said, in the careful voice of a man who's trying to be reasonable. and is slightly confused about why the conversation has become complicated. The bunkhouse is, I know what you meant, she said, and I know what it would mean if I accepted it. They'll be comfortable enough. Gideon, she said his name, without asking his permission to use it. Cormac worked 16-hour days in a mine from the time he was 14. He organized men, he mediated disputes. He trained half the young miners in that district. He was invaluable to that company, and they threw him away when it was convenient and put his name on a lie. She set down the wooden spoon. Zeke can look at a broken machine and understand it the way some men read a clock. He is 20 years old, and he has already taught himself more about mechanics than most men twice his age will ever know. And Toby. She stopped for a breath. Toby is 15, she said. He is deaf in one ear, and he has been afraid to talk to strangers since the collapse, because he can't always hear his own voice well enough to know if it's coming out right. But he draws everything he sees. Everything. With a precision that I can't describe to you, except to say that you would not believe a boy made it. Gideon was still. He was listening. They are not scraps, she said. They do not eat scraps, and they do not sit at a separate table while I eat at yours. If that is a condition you can't manage, then we should have a different conversation entirely. But if we're going to work this ranch together for a full season, we eat together, silence. The stove popped once behind her. Meals at the main house table, he said finally. This morning. That was my condition. Yes, and you said it in the morning, and you're trying to change it now. I'm not trying to. He stopped, looked at the table. 3 chairs. I'll need to add to that table. Yes, she said, you will. I have pine boards in the east shed. I know. I saw them this morning. Something crossed his face, not a smile, nowhere near a smile, but the faint precursor to one, the shadow of the shape of it. Then it was gone. Supper in an hour, she said, and turned back to the stove. He went to the east shed. She heard sawing after a while. Then the sound of a plane working along a board, long, smooth strokes. Then quiet, then more sawing. She cooked and listened to the sound of it and didn't examine why it made the cooking feel easier. Her brothers came in for supper to find the table changed. It was the same table, same base, same legs, but a wide pine board had been added to the end and smoothed down and fitted with care, and where there had been 3 chairs there were now 5. 4 of the originals plus a bench along the new section made from another board, solid enough to sit on without wobbling. Gideon was washing sawdust off his hands at the basin when they came in. He dried his hands and looked at the table as if checking it was level, then looked up and said nothing. Cormac looked at the table, then at Gideon. He didn't say anything either. Maeve put the pot on the table, and they sat down. It was crowded enough that elbows occasionally touched. Toby sat at the end of the new section, which put him at a corner where he could see everyone's faces. Gideon sat across from him. Maeve served. They ate. Partway through the meal, Gideon looked at Toby and turned his chair to face him directly. When he spoke slowly and clearly, not exaggerating his lip movement, just making it readable. The north fence line needs new markers past the creek, he said. I can tell you where, but I need someone who can draw an accurate map of the terrain from observation. Could you do that? Toby put down his fork and looked at Gideon with an expression that said he was making sure he'd read the question correctly. Then he looked at Maeve. She nodded once. He looked back at Gideon and nodded. Good, Gideon said, and went back to his supper. Toby picked up his fork. His expression had shifted in some way that was difficult to name but easy to understand if you'd ever watched someone be given a task that matched what they were actually capable of, instead of a smaller task assigned on the assumption that they'd need less. Maeve watched Cormac watch that exchange from across the table. His hands were still around his bowl. The lines in his face, which had been tight and deep since Cold Creek, eased by some small degree. Later, after the dishes were done and her brothers had gone back to the bunkhouse, Maeve sat by the kitchen stove with a mending basket and worked through 3 shirts that needed attention. Gideon sat at the far end of the room with a ledger book and a pencil, and did whatever it was he did with his accounts, which from the sound of his breathing was probably not making him feel any better about the state of things. They didn't talk much. At one point, he said, without looking up Zeke, "What does he know about windmills?" "He knows about anything mechanical," she said. "Whether he's seen it before is almost beside the point. Give him half a day, and he'll understand it better than the man who installed it." Gideon wrote something in the ledger. A little later, Cormac's lungs. She kept her needle moving. Black lung. Early stages. Rest helps. Bad air makes it worse. He needs to stay away from confined, dusty spaces. Open pasture work. Yes, I can manage that. Outside, the wind came up. It moved through the sage with a sound that was almost like water. The fire in the stove made its quiet internal sounds, and the lamp on the table put out a steady gold circle of light. "You meant what you said at the depot," Gideon said. "It wasn't a question. About leaving if you don't pull weight. I meant all of it, and if you do pull weight, then we talk," she said. Like I said, he was quiet for a while. "I don't find talking easy," he said, finally. "I noticed. I'm not saying it as an excuse. I'm saying it so you know what you're working with." She looked up from the mending for the first time in a while. He was still looking at the ledger, but he wasn't writing anything. His pencil rested against the page. "I find silence easy enough," she said. "I didn't grow up in a quiet house, but silence can work when it's honest." He looked up then, held her gaze for a moment. "All right," he said. She went back to the shirt. The fire burned steadily, and outside the Nevada night settled in with all its particular cold weight, and in the bunkhouse across the yard, a lamp burned until late. And twice Maeve heard the careful, muffled sound of Cormac's cough carrying through the dark, and both times she held still and listened until it was done, and quiet came back again. In the morning, she told herself. In the morning there would be fence to mend, and a windmill to fix, and a root cellar to take proper inventory of, and 400 things to learn about a ranch she'd never seen until yesterday evening. In the morning, for now she sewed, and he figured, and the stove held its heat, and the night passed over Red Ridge without taking anything with it. That was enough. For a first night, that was enough. The windmill had been dead for 7 months. Gideon knew this because he'd watched it stop turning on a Tuesday in February and had written it in the back of his ledger with the grim accounting of a man who notes disasters but doesn't always have the resources to fix them. He'd been hauling water from the creek to the near paddocks by hand since then 200 yards, twice a day, with a pair of buckets that left deep grooves in his palms. The far paddocks he'd simply given up on, which was why the eastern grazing land had gone brown and stayed brown, while the cattle crowded into the western quarter and ate it down to dirt. 7 months of that. And Zeke Holloway fixed it in 3 days, not 3 straight days. 3 days of intermittent attention between the other work. Zeke was pulling alongside everyone else fence posts in the morning, grain hauling in the afternoon, and then evenings with his sleeves rolled up and his head inside the windmill's gear housing, working by lantern light until Maeve made him stop. The problem, as Zeke explained it to Gideon on the first day, while standing 20 feet up the iron frame, with the confidence of a man who has never had much respect for heights, was a cracked drive shaft coupling where the mill connected to the pump rod below. "You can see it from here," Zeke called down. Gideon stood at the base and looked up. He could not see it from there. "The crack propagates from the bolt hole," Zeke continued. "Someone over-tightened it. Probably 2 winters ago, if the rust pattern's right. Once it cracked, every windstorm put more stress on it until it sheared. Can you repair it, or does it need replacing?" Zeke was quiet for a moment, studying the thing. "If I sleeve it with iron stock and re-drill the bolt hole offset 2 inches, it'll be stronger than the original," he said. "Do you have iron stock in the shed?" "Some. I'll need the forge hot by morning." Gideon had the forge hot by morning. What Zeke produced over the following 2 days was objectively impressive. He fabricated a reinforcing sleeve from flat iron stock, shaped it over the forge anvil with a precision that seemed casual and wasn't, drilled the offset hole by hand, and reassembled the coupling with a tension that he tested by feeling alone, turning the bolt until some internal measurement, only he had access to, told him it was right. On the third afternoon, the wind came up from the southwest the way it usually did in that valley around 4 o'clock, and the windmill began to turn. Gideon stood in the yard and listened to the pump rod begin to work. He listened to the sound of water moving up through 30 feet of pipe, and then water came out at the trough, clear and cold and steady, and the cattle at the fence line caught the sound and smell of it and began moving toward it immediately, the way animals do when they know something that has been wrong for a long time is right again. Zeke came down the frame and stood beside him, wiping his hands on a rag. "The eastern paddocks," Gideon said. "You'll need to run a pipe extension from the main line," Zeke said. 30, maybe 40 feet. "Do you have pipe?" "I can get it." "Then yes. You'll have water to the east pasture by end of next week." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "That's 40 acres I wrote off." "Write them back on," Zeke said simply, and walked to the water trough to wash his hands properly. It was around, this time, that Gideon began to revise some of his internal accounting. Not about the arrangement was the arrangement, and he hadn't changed his position on it, but about what 4 pairs of working hands actually meant in practice, day by day, when they belonged to people who understood what the work required without needing it explained. The revision was uncomfortable, in the way that being wrong about something tends to be uncomfortable. He'd expected to manage them. He was finding instead that they mostly managed themselves. Maeve had the household running better in 2 weeks than it had run in 2 years. Not because she was doing more she wasn't. She was doing the same amount Gideon had done, but because she did it with an organization that compounded on itself. Stores tracked and rotated meals, planned 3 days ahead, so nothing ran out unexpectedly. The root cellar inventoried and sorted with labels she'd made from torn paper and a piece of charcoal. She'd also started keeping a second ledger, which she'd bought in town on Saturday with her own money, and in which she recorded the ranch's daily expenses and income in a column format that was considerably clearer than Gideon's own system. She hadn't offered this to him. She'd left it on the table one morning beside his coffee, open to the first page. He'd studied it for 20 minutes and said nothing, and taken it to his desk and hadn't given it back, which she understood as the compliment it was meant to be. Cormac worked the fence line and the cattle with a methodical steadiness that cost him more than it should have, but produced results regardless. He didn't complain about his lungs. He managed his breathing the way a man manages a difficult tool with attention and adjustment, working around the limitation rather than against it. On the days the wind was bad and the dust was up, Gideon quietly redirected him to the barn work without making it into a conversation, and Cormac accepted the redirection without making it into one either. Those two had arrived at a wordless working arrangement that Maeve watched with some relief. They weren't friends, they weren't anywhere near friends, but they were men who respected the work, and that was a sufficient foundation for now. And Toby had completed the terrain map. It was extraordinary, was the thing. Gideon had shown him the fence line boundary and described the landmarks Creek Bend, Standing Rock, the double pine at the northeast corner. And 2 days later, Toby had produced a map drawn on the back of 4 sheets of writing paper, pieced together, accurate to a degree, that would have taken a professional surveyor a week with proper instruments. Every elevation change was indicated, every drainage line. The fence posts were marked as small squares, and where posts were missing or damaged, he'd marked those in a different notation that he'd explained in a brief key in the corner. Gideon had looked at it for a long time. Then he'd had Toby show him the notation system, which Toby did by pointing to each symbol and writing its meaning beside it in a clear, careful hand, Gideon nodded at each one. When Toby finished, Gideon folded the map once, very carefully, and put it in the inside pocket of his work jacket. He carried it there for the next 3 days. It was on a Thursday, nearly 3 weeks in, that Maeve first heard the Shoshone family's wagon coming up the track. She was in the garden, or what would eventually be a garden. She was still turning the ground when she heard wheels on the dry road and looked up. A wagon, smaller than Gideon's, with 2 adults on the bench and 2 children in the back. They stopped at the edge of the yard, and the man on the bench called out something in a language Maeve didn't know. Gideon came out of the tool shed and raised a hand. He walked to the wagon and spoke with the man for a few minutes. Then he came back to where Maeve was standing. "Elias and Mary Toya," he said. "They live about 4 miles east toward the ridge. Their grain grinder seized up. I've helped them a few times with fence repairs in exchange for some of their root knowledge. They know this valley better than anyone." He paused. "I'd fix it myself, but I haven't got the time today. Thought Zeke might." "Zeke," Maeve called. He appeared from around the side of the windmill where he'd been beginning the pipe extension. She jerked her head toward the Toya wagon. He wiped his hands and walked over and introduced himself with a nod, and within 2 minutes he was climbing into their wagon to look at the grinder. It took him most of the afternoon. The grinding stone had cracked along an existing fault, a problem that was going to happen regardless, given that the stone had been compromised for some time and needed to be replaced, which couldn't be done there. But the seizing was a separate issue, a bearing that had lost its lubrication and warped under the friction. Zeke fabricated a replacement bearing from brass stock he found in Gideon's shed, which was not a precise match but was close enough, and reset the whole assembly. The grinder ran. Elias Toya watched Zeke work with the specific attention of someone who was both grateful and genuinely interested in the method. He asked questions through Mary, who translated about what Zeke was doing and why at each step. Zeke answered them in the same way he answered everything, directly and without condescension, treating the questions as what they were, a person trying to understand so they could manage the thing themselves next time. When it was done, Mary Toya went to their wagon and came back with a small cloth bundle. She handed it to Zeke, who brought it to Maeve. She said, "It's for the man with the cough." Maeve translated for Zeke, who relayed it to Cormac when Cormac came in from the south pasture. Inside the cloth were dried roots, pale and slightly bitter-smelling, with a folded paper on which Mary had drawn a simple preparation diagram, roots in water, simmered, strained. Maeve boiled them that evening. The tea was dark and sharp, and Cormac drank it slowly, with the expression of a man who has consumed enough bad medicine in his life that he stopped judging it on taste. That night he slept through without coughing. The first full night he'd slept through since the collapse. Maeve heard the silence from the loft and recognized it for what it was, and lay there with her eyes open for a long time, not because she was worried, but because relief, genuine relief, sometimes needs a moment to be received properly. The rifle lesson happened because Maeve asked for it. She'd been thinking about it for a week. Red Ridge was a working ranch in an isolated valley, and she'd seen enough of the land now to understand that the isolation wasn't romantic. It was a practical condition with practical consequences. A person alone on this land needed to know how to handle a firearm. She'd grown up with them. Her father had kept a shotgun, and she knew the basic mechanics. But Gideon had a Winchester carbine mounted above the kitchen door, and the Winchester was a different instrument entirely. She asked him on a Wednesday evening while he was cleaning the rifle at the table, "Would you show me how to shoot that properly?" He looked up. Then he looked back at the rifle, and then at her. "You fired a gun before?" "Shotgun, I know load and aim, and don't point it at anything you're not ready to lose. But I've never worked a lever action." He thought about it for about half a second longer than was strictly necessary. "Saturday morning," he said, "after stores." Saturday after stores they drove back from town, and Gideon pulled the wagon up at the far end of the south pasture, where a line of fence posts ran along a low ridge, and there was nothing beyond them but open hillside for half a mile. He set up 3 posts at increasing distances with tin cans, on top 20 yards, 40 yards, 60 yards, and he stood beside her at the shooter's position and talked her through the rifle. The Winchester Model 1873, he explained, was a lever-action, repeating rifle. It held 15 rounds in the magazine. The lever cycled the action, ejected the spent case, chambered a fresh round, cocked the hammer. You had to complete the lever stroke fully, or the action wouldn't close properly. Here, he said, and demonstrated. The lever came down and back up with a smooth mechanical click. Do that slow first, until the motion is in your hands. The rifle will teach you the right speed. She took it. It was heavier than the shotgun. The balance was different, the weight forward, in the barrel, which changed how you had to hold it. She worked the lever slowly, feeling the mechanism, the slight resistance at the bottom of the stroke, the clean snap at the top. Again, he said. She did it again, and again. Now raise it. She raised the rifle to her shoulder. He stepped beside her, without touching her, correcting her elbow angle with a word rather than a hand, moving her chin with a gesture she understood. The rear sight and the front sight need to be aligned, he said, both in the same plane. Most people hurry the sight picture. Don't hurry it. The Nevada sun was coming down at them from the west, and it was warm, desert warm, and the air smelled like sage and dry dust, and the faint metal scent of the rifle. Gideon was close enough that she was aware of him, the way you become aware of things that are close, the particular heat of another person in the sun, the steadiness of his breathing. She aligned the sights on the first tin can. When you squeeze the trigger, he said, his voice steady and close, do it between breaths. Exhale halfway, hold, then squeeze. She exhaled halfway and held and squeezed. The shot broke sharp and flat across the valley. The tin can jumped and fell. He was quiet for a moment. Good, he said. It was one word, and it was plainly meant, and it landed differently than compliments that came with more words. She kept her eyes forward and worked the lever. Next one, he said. She found the sight picture on the second can, 40 yards out. It took longer. She exhaled wrong and had to start over, and he didn't say anything, just waited. She found it again. She squeezed. The can stayed put. The shot had gone wide. She'd pulled left at the trigger brake. You anticipated the recoil, he said. You flinched before the shot left. I know, she said. I felt it. It takes a while. The body learns the shot will come before it comes and starts protecting itself early. You have to teach it to wait. How repetition, he said. You shoot it enough times that the recoil stops being a surprise, and eventually the flinch goes away. She worked the lever and raised the rifle again. This time she went deliberately slower. She found the can. She paid attention to her own hand on the trigger, to the moment before the trigger broke, and she let herself wait. The shot went off, and the can jumped and fell. There it is, he said. They stood there for another half hour. She worked through most of the second box of rounds he'd brought, and somewhere in the middle of it, something changed in how they were standing. They'd started with a foot of distance between them, which was appropriate, and somewhere in the back and forth of loading and shooting and correcting and shooting again, that foot had become 6 inches, which was less appropriate, but seemed to have happened without either of them deciding it. His hands were calloused and brown from the work, and at one point he reached past her to demonstrate something on the rear sight, and his hand and hers were both on the walnut stalk at the same time, and neither of them moved immediately. The contact lasted about 3 seconds. Then she raised the rifle and found her sight picture, and he stepped back 1 step, and neither of them said anything about it. The sun was burning orange toward the ridgeline and throwing long shadows across the sage flats when she fired the last round. The third can, 60 yards, which she'd been avoiding until she felt ready for it. She aligned the sights with care. She exhaled halfway. She waited. The can came down. She lowered the rifle and worked the lever on the empty chamber out of habit. And she heard his breath change a short exhale, the kind that comes with something more than professional satisfaction. She looked at him. He was looking at the empty can at 60 yards. Then he looked at her, and whatever he'd been about to say, he didn't say, and that was fine, because she wasn't sure she was ready for what was in his face at that moment, and she suspected he felt the same. Same time next Saturday, she said. Yes, he said. They drove back to the ranch in the early dark, with the sage turning gray around them and the first stars coming out, close enough on the wagon bench that the ride back felt different from the ride out, and both of them were quiet in a way that was doing something, rather than saying nothing. At supper, Zeke announced that the pipe extension was complete and the eastern paddocks would have water by morning. Gideon looked up from his plate and said, "How far did you run it?" 42 feet. I found an elbow fitting in the back of the shed that gave me the angle to the trough site. The fittings in the back of the shed are old. I know. I replaced the washers. They'll hold, Cormac said from across the table. What's the flow rate going to be at that distance? Zeke and Gideon both looked at him. Zeke said, but enough. The elevation drop helps. Cormac nodded. That was the first full-sentence technical conversation that had happened across that table, among all 5 of them. Maeve noticed it, but didn't remark on it. Because remarking on things like that tended to make people aware they were doing them, which sometimes made them stop. Toby was drawing, even at supper. A quick sketch on the edge of a paper, looking at Gideon's face, and then back down. Gideon hadn't noticed, or had noticed, and was choosing not to comment. Either way, after supper, while the dishes were being cleared, Mary Toya's root bundle was still on the shelf above the stove. Maeve looked at it and thought about Cormac sleeping through the night. She thought about the Toya children in the back of that wagon, quiet, watchful, wearing shoes that had been mended past what shoes could reasonably sustain. She thought about Zeke sitting in the dirt of the Toya yard, explaining bearing mechanics with the same patience he'd give to anyone who genuinely wanted to understand. And she thought about that tin can falling at 60 yards, and the half-second of Gideon's hand beside hers on the walnut stalk, and the way the desert light had been sitting on everything, like something that had been put there on purpose. She dried the last dish and put it away. The fire in the stove burned low. Outside, the water flowed in the pipe Zeke had laid, moving east in the dark toward 40 acres of land that had been written off, and above the valley, the Nevada sky laid out its full catalog of stars, which was overwhelming when you were used to Pennsylvania and its weather and its closed-in hills, and which was still, after 3 weeks, something Maeve had not gotten used to. She stood at the kitchen window for a moment before going up. Somewhere across the yard, a door closed softly in the bunkhouse. The windmill turned. She went up to the loft. Below her, she heard Gideon at the table for a while, the pencil on paper, the ledger. Then the lamp went out. Red Ridge settled into its night sounds, the windmill, the cattle, the far-off complaint of something that lived in the sage and had opinions about the dark. And under all of it, steady and present, the sound of water moving through iron pipe toward dry ground, which was not a small sound if you understood what it meant. Fletcher King rode in on a Friday. He came with 2 men behind him, and a posture that announced itself well before his face was visible upright in the saddle, slow on purpose, the studied pace of a man who wanted it, understood that his time was more valuable than yours, and he was doing you a favor by spending any of it here. Gideon saw the horses coming up the track from the main house window. He was at the table with Maeve's ledger, working through the September numbers, which were better than August had been. Not good, better. There was a difference, and he'd been sitting with it for an hour, trying to decide if better was enough. He closed the ledger and went outside. Fletcher King was somewhere north of 50, built wide across the chest, with the soft overlay of a man who'd once been physical and now paid other people to be physical for him. He wore a good coat, real broadcloth, Carson City money, and his boots were the kind that had never seen a mud puddle they hadn't been cleaned off after. He had a full mustache going silver at the edges and pale eyes that moved across Red Ridge with the quick inventory of a man who is always calculating what things are worth and what it would take to own them. His two men stayed on their horses. They wore their guns visible and low, which was a statement, not a precaution. Mercer, King said, pulling up and resting one hand on his saddle horn. He didn't dismount. Good to see the place is still standing, King, Gideon said. He didn't walk out to meet him. He stood at the edge of the porch and let King do the work of raising his voice to cover the distance. Maeve appeared in the doorway behind him. He heard her stop there and stay. I'll make this brief, King said. I'm acquiring water rights in this valley. I've spoken to most of your neighbors already. The terms are fair. How fair? King named a figure. It was low. Not insultingly low. King was too careful for that, but low enough. Low enough that Gideon did the arithmetic in his head in about 4 seconds and understood exactly what King was offering. Enough to clear the banknote with almost nothing left over, which would get Harlan Fitch off his back and put Gideon Mercer off his land inside of 2 years. Water rights in this valley weren't just water. Gideon knew that. The aquifer Zeke had tapped ran under a significant portion of the eastern range, and whoever controlled access to that water controlled who could ranch here and who couldn't. King wasn't buying water rights. He was buying leverage. I'll pass, Gideon said. King's expression didn't change much. You haven't looked at my paperwork. I don't need to look at your paperwork. The offer doesn't improve with time, Mercer. Markets move. So do people, Gideon said. You're free to move yours back down my track. One of the men behind King shifted in his saddle. It was a small movement, just a weight adjustment, but Gideon noted it the way he'd noted small movements in the war as information. King looked at the yard, at the working windmill, at the new pipe running east. His gaze moved to Zeke, who had come around from the equipment shed and was standing with a wrench in his hand, not threatening, just present, looking at King's horses with calm assessment. I heard you picked up some help, King said. Brought a family on. Ranch hands, Gideon said. King's pale eyes moved to Zeke and stayed there. I also heard something interesting about your young mechanic there. Something about a record. Gideon said nothing. Petty theft out of Dunmore County, Pennsylvania, King said. He said it conversationally. The way you mentioned the weather. There's a warrant outstanding, minor jurisdiction, but warrants travel. Behind Gideon, in the doorway, Maeve had gone very still. Zeke hadn't moved. His face hadn't changed. He was looking at King with a steadiness that Gideon recognized. It was the look of someone who has already calculated the threat and is waiting to see how the person next to them responds before they decide what to do with their own body. Gideon stepped off the porch. He walked toward King's horse at an even pace and stopped at a distance that put him close enough to be taken seriously and far enough to be deliberate. He looked up at King without squinting, even though the sun was wrong for it. A man stole bread, Gideon said, and salt pork, because a coal company held his wages for 6 weeks and the boarding house cut them off. King's expression shifted by a fraction. The law doesn't distinguish motive, Mercer. No, Gideon said. It doesn't always. That's one of the law's failures, not one of the man's. Be that as it may, there's a county marshal in Cold Creek, Gideon said. Tom Briggs, I've known him 12 years. He's an honest man, which is probably inconvenient for your purposes. He paused. If you were planning to bring Zeke's record to Briggs as a way of pressuring me, I'd encourage you to think carefully about what Briggs is going to ask you in return. Like why a mining baron from 2 territories over is personally interested in a 20-year-old's juvenile warrant. King looked at him for a moment. I'm offering you a fair price, King said, for something that's going to become a liability. You're offering me a low price, Gideon said, for something you want very badly. That tells me something about what it's actually worth. He held King's gaze. We're done here. King didn't move immediately. He let a pause happen, the long calculated pause of a man who is deciding whether he's been beaten in this moment or whether he's choosing to step back. Then he gathered his reins. "Think on it," King said. "The offer stands until end of month." "It'll still be standing at the end of the month," Gideon said. "Because I'll still be saying no." King turned his horse. His two men turned with him. They rode back down the track at the same deliberate pace, and Gideon watched them all the way to the bend without moving. When they were gone, he turned. The yard had filled up. Cormac was at the corner of the bunkhouse. Toby was at the garden fence. Maeve was on the porch. Zeke was still standing with the wrench, but he'd lowered it to his side. Gideon looked at Zeke. "He knows about the warrant," he said. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't an accusation either. "He would," Zeke said, "if he's been looking into us. It's not a secret." "It's not a problem," Gideon said. Zeke looked at him directly. "You don't have to say that. I'm not saying it to make you feel better," Gideon said. "I'm saying it because it's true. Tom Briggs runs this county on what actually happened, not on what someone with a money interest decides to file. And what actually happened is that a boy took food when a company left him without wages or options. He kept his voice even. That's not a crime I'm prepared to hold against a man. A beat of quiet," Cormac said. From the corner of the bunkhouse, "He'll be back." "Yes," Gideon said. "He will. With something worse. Probably." Maeve came down off the porch. She stopped beside Gideon and looked at the empty track where King's horses had raised a thin dust cloud that was still settling. "What does he actually want?" she asked. "Not the water rights, the real thing." "The real thing is the same thing," Gideon said. "Control of who can operate in this valley. Water is infrastructure here. Whoever owns the water rights owns the grazing capacity. If King buys out enough ranches, he can dictate terms to everyone who's left prices, access, whatever he wants. The ones who won't sell will find their banknotes called in by banks King already controls. Does he control Fitch's bank?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. I've wondered." Maeve turned and looked at him. "That's worth finding out." "Yes," he said. "It is." They stood there for a moment, both looking at the track. "He knew about us before he rode in," she said. "He knew about Zeke's record. He knew about the family arrangement. He did his research first. That's how he operates. Which means he thinks this ranch matters enough to research." She paused. "That's useful information. He wouldn't bother if we weren't a problem for him." Gideon looked at her sideways. "You're taking a land baron's threat as a compliment," he said. "I'm taking it as information," she said. "There's a difference." He almost smiled. The near smile was becoming a thing she could identify. Now the faint adjustment at one corner of his mouth, the slight change in the set of his eyes. It lasted less than a second and left no evidence. "Go back to what you were doing," he said, addressing the yard in general. "He's gone." Everyone went back to what they were doing. Gideon went inside. He sat at the table and opened the ledger, but he didn't look at numbers. He thought about King's pale eyes moving across the ranch, the inventory expression, the pause, before he'd gathered his reins. King hadn't been done. That pause wasn't concession. It was a man storing information and recalculating. And Gideon had been in enough situations where the other party was recalculating to know that the next move would be more considered than the first one. He picked up his pen. He wrote a letter to Tom Briggs. Not about the warrant, he'd meant what he said about Briggs and Briggs's methods, but about King's land acquisition activity in the valley, and whether any of the boundary claims King was using had been filed with the territorial office or existed only as private agreements. It was the kind of question that a county marshal could put to the territorial recorder without raising much alarm, and the answer might tell Gideon something he needed to know. He also wrote a letter to a man named Calloway in Carson City, a former Army logistics officer turned territorial land agent whom Gideon had known since the war. He asked Calloway to look at the record of water rights transfers in the valley over the past 3 years and tell him what he saw. He sealed both letters and put them in his coat to take to town in the morning. Then he went outside, because sitting with this particular kind of worry was not productive, and the afternoon still had 3 hours of work in it. Cormac was back on the fence line. Zeke had gone back to the shed. Toby was at the north end of the garden, and he was doing something Gideon hadn't expected. He was digging, carefully, at the base of the garden's north wall, and he had a bucket beside him with water in it, and he was clearly laying out a drainage channel. Gideon stopped and looked at it. The garden had a water problem he hadn't solved. When the heavy rains came in late September, the north wall collected runoff from the slope above, and the garden flooded. He'd been managing it by hand bailing for 2 years, which was ridiculous, and he knew it was ridiculous. And he hadn't had the time or the thought to address it properly. Toby had seen it, and apparently, without discussing it with anyone, he'd decided to address it. Gideon walked over and crouched beside him. Toby looked up, then faced him properly so he could read what was being said. "Where are you draining it to?" Gideon asked. Toby pointed east. He made a motion with his hand indicating a gradual slope, then pointed to the ground 20 feet out, past the garden edge. "There's a low spot there," Gideon said, "but it's rock underneath about 6 inches down." Toby nodded. He picked up a piece of charcoal from his shirt pocket and drew quickly in the dirt a simple cross-section. Channel coming out of the garden, hitting the rock layer, redirecting along the surface to the east drainage path. Gideon studied the drawing. "You'd need to line the channel below the garden wall," he said, "or it'll erode." Toby drew again, small rectangles along the base of the channel stones. "I've got flat stones in the pile by the east shed," Gideon said. "Left over from the foundation repair 2 years ago." Toby raised his eyebrows in a question. "Yes," Gideon said. "Use them." Toby nodded and went back to digging. Gideon stood up and looked at the channel start for a moment. It was correctly placed. The angle was right. The boy had looked at the terrain and worked out a drainage solution from observation alone, and he'd done it without needing to be asked. He went to get the flat stones. They worked the drainage channel together. For the rest of the afternoon, without much communication beyond the pointing and the occasional drawing in the dirt. It was good work, concrete and solvable, with a clear result at the end. Gideon laid the stone lining while Toby set the grade, checking it with a small amount of water poured in the channel and watching where it went. By the time the light started going, the channel was done. Toby poured a full bucket in at the high end, and they watched it run clean and straight to the east drainage path and disperse without pooling. Toby looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at the channel. "Good work," he said, facing Toby directly. He said it the same way he'd said it to Maeve on the rifle range, one word, plain, meaning it. Toby ducked his head briefly, not with embarrassment, but with the compact gesture of someone receiving something they hadn't been sure was coming. They cleaned up and went in for supper. At the table, Maeve had made a bean and venison stew that was better than its ingredients had any right to suggest. She'd been experimenting with the wild herbs that grew on the south slope. Mary Toya had shown her which ones were good, and the result was that dinner at Red Ridge had been getting progressively less Spartan over the last 3 weeks, without anyone having commented on it directly. The conversation at supper was about King, because it was going to be regardless of whether they addressed it. "He'll try the bank," Cormac said. He had a directness in conversation that came from years of organizing. Men he didn't work up to the point he started at it. "Possibly," Gideon said. "I'm looking into whether he has existing influence with Fitch." "What does the banknote say, exactly?" Maeve asked. 11 months left, settled family condition, which we're currently meeting. Regular payment schedule, which we're meeting. If I default on a payment, the full note accelerates, the whole amount comes due immediately." "What's the payment amount?" Maeve asked. He told her. She put her spoon down and looked at the ledger she'd left on the end of the table. She picked it up and looked at it for a moment. "September's number, if it holds through October, it should hold. If the cattle price in Carson City doesn't drop, If it doesn't drop, you make the payment with about $40 clear, she said. Yes? That's thin. Yes, Zeke said. What's the eastern pasture worth now that the water's running? If I can get 30 head onto it by November, and they winter well, more than $40 clear, Zeke said. Considerably, Gideon said. Cormac said. So the question is whether King can move fast enough to interfere before you stabilize. That's the question, Gideon said, and whether he has a legal tool to do it with, or whether he's working with threats and pressure. The water rights claim, Maeve said. Can he file one? Is there anything in the territorial record that gives him standing to claim the aquifer? That's what I'm asking Calloway in Carson City. When will you hear back? 2 weeks, maybe 3. Territorial mail is what it is. Cormac looked at his hands around the bowl. While you're waiting, he's moving. Yes, Gideon said. So am I. There was a directness in the room that hadn't been there at the beginning. 6 weeks in now, and something had consolidated. These 5 people at a pine mule with an added board had been through enough of the daily work together that they'd stopped having separate strategies. Not because anyone had sat down and decided that it had happened the way practical things happen when people work side by side long enough. Toby was drawing King's face from memory. Gideon could see it happening at the edge of his vision, the quick lines building up the structure of a face on the margins of the same paper he'd been using since morning. The likeness was going to be accurate. He could tell from the lines that were already there. He thought about what Maeve had said on the porch after King left. He wouldn't bother if we weren't a problem for him. She was right. Fletcher King had ridden out here personally with a prepared speech and a known warrant and a price ready in his mouth. And that meant King had done his accounting and decided Red Ridge Ranch was worth the trouble of a personal visit, which meant the water under Red Ridge's land was more significant than King wanted Gideon to know, which meant Zeke's pump extension to the eastern pasture had probably been noticed by someone who reported to King, and what it had told King was that the aquifer was accessible and productive, and that was a problem for King's plans. The pump extension had triggered the visit. Gideon thought about that for a moment. Then he thought about Calloway's letter, and Briggs's letter, and the ledger in front of Maeve, and the drainage channel in the garden, and the rifle at 60 yards. And then he thought about what King's face had done in that long pause before he gathered his reins. The recalculation. He'll file something, Gideon said. Before the end of the month, before my offer deadline. He'll file something official to create a legal complication. It doesn't have to be valid. It just has to be expensive to fight. Then we need to know what we're defending before he files, Maeve said. Yes. Which means Calloway's letter needs to arrive faster than the mail usually moves. I'll send a telegraph to Carson City tomorrow morning, Gideon said. More expensive, but faster. I should have done it first instead of the letter. Maeve looked at him. Send the telegraph. He nodded. The supper ended, and the dishes happened, and the lamp burned in the main house for a longer time than usual that night because Gideon was at the table, and Maeve was at the other end with the ledger, and they were working through scenarios in the companionable quiet of 2 people who have decided to solve the same problem. Not the same problem they'd arrived at Red Ridge to solve. That problem had been simpler. Back in August 1 banknote, 1 marriage arrangement, 1 struggling cattle operation. King had handed them a different problem, larger and with more pieces, and the remarkable thing was that it didn't feel impossible. It felt like work. Hard work, the kind with uncertain outcomes and real stakes, but work that had hands to do it and heads to think it through. At some point, Maeve said, without looking up from the ledger, he made a mistake today. Which one? Gideon said. He showed you how much he wants it, she said. You can't unhear that. Gideon was quiet, he said. He went back to his figures. Outside, the windmill turned steady in the night wind off the ridge, and the water moved in its pipes, and the cattle in the eastern pasture drank from a trough that hadn't had water in it for 7 months, and Fletcher King rode back toward wherever Fletcher King slept, carrying a recalculation that wasn't finished yet. Red Ridge held its ground in the dark. It had been doing that for some time now, and it had more help at it than it used to. The cattle drive took 11 days. Gideon had done it alone the previous 2 years, or nearly alone, a hired man named Casper, who'd quit in June and not been replaced. And before that, a neighbor's son who'd helped for 2 seasons before his family moved north. Both times the drive had been barely managed. Cattle lost to the coolies, weight dropped on the trail from poor pacing, prices at the Carson City yards lower than they should have been, because the animals arrived stressed and thin. This time was different. Cormac took the left flank. He was on a horse that Gideon had initially doubted he could handle a big roan with opinions, and he'd handled it from the first morning with the patient authority of someone who understands that animals and people respond to the same thing, which is steadiness. He didn't fight the roan. He negotiated with it, and by the 3rd day, the horse had decided this was a man worth working for. Zeke rode drag, the dusty rear position nobody volunteered for, and he did it without complaint and with a mechanical efficiency that kept the trailing cattle moving at the right pace to neither exhaust themselves nor fall behind. He also fixed a broken saddle ring on day 4 with a piece of wire and a rock, which was the kind of improvisation that Gideon noted and stored. Maeve cooked for the camp and managed the supply wagon, and also, on the 2 nights when the cattle were restless and they needed an extra rider on the perimeter, she saddled up and rode without being asked. She knew where to be and when to turn an animal and when to let it go and circle back. She'd said she could ride. She'd been understating herself. Toby stayed at the ranch with explicit instructions to keep the stoves going, check the cattle trough, and not let anything burn down. He'd accepted this with the quiet dignity of someone who understood they'd been left with real responsibility, not a child's errand. When they returned, the ranch was in better order than they'd left it. The trough was full, and there was a detailed pencil record of everything that had happened in 11 days' weather, wildlife. A loose fence board he'd repaired himself, laid out on the kitchen table in Toby's careful hand. The price at the Carson City yards was fair. Not exceptional cattle markets were cattle markets, but fair. And fair was enough. When Gideon came out of the stockyard office with the payment in his coat, he stopped on the boardwalk and did the arithmetic one more time. Bank payment. Supply cost for winter. Feed. The pipe fittings Zeke needed for the secondary line. When he was done, there was money left. Not much, but it was on the right side of zero, which was a place Red Ridge hadn't reliably stood in 2 years. He found Maeve at the wagon on the edge of the yards, tallying the drive expenses against the number she'd carried in her head from the ledger. She looked up when he came over. He told her the number. She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of disappointment. The other kind. Clear? She asked. After the bank and the supplies and Zeke's pipe fittings. She looked at the stockyard office, then back at him. The eastern pasture will double that by spring, if the winter's reasonable. Even if it's not, she said. Cormac's been supplementing the grazing rotation. Those animals are going to winter better than they have in a while. Gideon knew she was right. He'd watched Cormac work out a grazing schedule over the last month, moving cattle between paddocks with an instinct that came from watching animals his whole life, not cattle specifically, but living things that needed management, and the principles were the same. The herd was in better condition than it had been in August. He put the payment envelope in his coat. Then we go home, he said. They drove back to Red Ridge in the early dark, the 4 of them on the wagon, and the satisfaction of the thing traveled with them without needing to be spoken about. At length, the celebration, if you could call it, that happened 3 nights after the drive. It was Cormac's idea, which surprised no one who understood how Cormac thought, which was that acknowledgement mattered. That people who did hard things together deserved a moment to recognize it before the next hard thing came. He'd found a jug of something in Cold Creek that the merchant had described as whiskey, and which was probably adjacent to whiskey in the way that a mule is adjacent to a horse. He'd bought it with his own money and said nothing about it until after supper, when he put it on the table and looked around at everyone and said, "We drove 300 head through the Sanders Pass in 9 days and came back with money in the man's pocket. Someone should drink to that." Gideon looked at the jug, then at Cormac. Zeke already had his hand out. They drank in the main house, too cold outside now. For comfort, the Nevada autumn having arrived without ceremony, temperatures dropping hard after dark, the fire was good. The lamp was lit. Toby had a cup of something warm that wasn't from the jug and sat at the end of the table drawing, and occasionally looking up when something made him laugh, which he knew by watching faces. Gideon talked more than he usually did. Not a lot more, but enough that Maeve noticed it, the slight relaxation of his economy with words, the willingness to follow a thought past the point where he'd normally stop. He told a story about a wagon stuck in the Sanders Pass 2 years ago that had devolved into a 20-minute negotiation with a mule that had philosophical objections to forward motion. He told it flat and dry, and Cormac laughed hard enough that it turned into a cough, and then he recovered and laughed again. This was progress. Specifically, Cormac laughing. After a while, Cormac and Zeke took the jug to the bunkhouse and Toby went with them, and Gideon and Maeve were left at the table with the fire and the end of the evening. He'd built this fire. He built every fire in this house, had built them alone for 2 years, and the silence after the brothers left was not the same silence. It would have been in August. It had a different texture, fuller. Maeve was looking at the fire. "We should go outside," he said, "before it gets too late." She looked at him. "I want to show you something," he said. "Bring your coat." They went out the back door and walked past the garden and up the low rise behind the house, where the sage thinned out and the rock came through, and you could see the valley and the ridge lines all at once. He came here sometimes when the house felt too interior, when the walls of his own thinking got close. The sky over Nevada on a clear October night was not a sky you could take lightly. It required something from you, attention, at minimum. They stood on the rise and looked at it. The fire they'd left behind threw a faint gold line under the back door. The windmill turned at the far edge of the yard. The valley spread out below and around them, dark except for the distant flicker of the Toya farm light, 4 miles east. Maeve put her hands in her coat pockets and tipped her head back. "I grew up under a ceiling of hills," she said. "You could see the sky, but it was framed. Picture. This is something else. It takes a while," he said. "Some people never adjust to this much open space. They need edges. Do you?" He thought about it. "No. I think I need the opposite. I spent too long in places where everything was close and loud and compressed." He paused. "Out here, when something's coming at you, you can see it from a long way off. That matters to me." She understood what he meant. She understood it specifically, the war behind it, the things he didn't say directly that she'd been assembling from the pieces he let show over the past 2 months. They sat down on the flat rock at the top of the rise, close enough to talk without raising their voices, with a foot between them, which was less than the distance that had existed between them at the beginning. The fire they'd made together in the valley below burned steadily. Around it, everything they'd built in 2 months, the windmill, the pipelines, the drainage channel, the fence line mended and marked, the garden put to bed for winter, the herd in better condition than it had been in years, the account in the black. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "The war," she said. "I don't need the details. But does it come back at night?" A pause. "Yes," he said, "the survivor's guilt." He looked at her sideways. "My father came back from Antietam," she said. "He was alive, and most of his regiment wasn't. I've seen what that does." Gideon was quiet for a moment. The night moved around them, slow and cold. "I was a combat engineer," he said. "We built things. Bridges, fortifications, and sometimes we blew things up." He stopped, started again. "The men who died were men I'd worked beside, men I'd given orders to. When you've given a man orders, and he's dead, there's an accounting you carry. Whether you gave the right orders, whether a different choice would have. He stopped. You carry it, she said. I carry it, he said. She didn't tell him to let it go. She didn't tell him the men died for a cause, or that he'd done his best, or any of the things people said that didn't help, and often made it worse. She just sat with it for a moment, which was what it needed. My brothers carry things too, she said. Cormac carries the 14 men who were in the shaft when it went. He got out and they didn't, and the logic of that is something he lives with every day. She looked at the valley. I think that's why he understands you, without either of you having to say it. Gideon looked at the valley too. He thought about Cormac on the roan horse, patient and steady, working the flank. About the nights on the drive when he'd heard Cormac cough in the dark, and then go quiet, and go back to work. He's a better man than the situation he came from, Gideon said. They all are, she said. But that's what situations do sometimes. They obscure what a person actually is. The fire in the house below threw a gold line. The stars moved at their imperceptible pace. He looked at her. She was looking at the valley, and the lamplight from the house, and the distant Toya farm light, and her profile was composed and clear in the cold air. She'd been working hard for 2 months, and she looked at not diminished by it, the other thing. Present, defined by it. A person who had pushed toward something, and the pushing showed in a good way. He'd been sitting with a feeling for a while that he hadn't known what to do with. It wasn't complicated in itself. The complication was his own suspicion of it, his habit of inventory, of checking anything that seemed valuable against the possibility that he was wrong about its value. He'd been wrong about things before. He'd been wrong about a bridge calculation in Virginia in 1863, and men had died for it. The habit of checking had come from that, and he'd kept it because it was right to keep it. But there were some things it was possible to check too long. He turned toward her. She looked back. Maeve, he said. Her name in his mouth was one syllable different from how other people said it. She'd noticed that, without meaning to notice it. She noticed it now. He was looking at her directly, with the same honesty he brought to everything, no pretense, no performance. Just the thing itself, laid out plainly. He kissed her. It was quiet and sure the way he did everything. His hand came up briefly to her jaw, and she leaned into it with a directness that matched his, because she'd been thinking about this moment, and she wasn't going to pretend she hadn't. She put her cold hand against his coat and felt the warmth of him through it. It lasted only a moment, long enough to be exactly what it was. When they separated, the night was still the same night, stars in the same places, valley below, windmill turning, gold line under the back door. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything, because some things don't need words immediately, and forcing words on them is a way of reducing them. After a while, she said, "We should go back in." "Yes," he said. They walked back down the rise to the house, and the cold came with them, and the fire inside was exactly as they'd left it, steady and warm, doing the work fires do. They'd been in bed, Maeve, in the loft. Gideon below for perhaps 2 hours when the night broke open. The first thing was the smell. Smoke came different from kerosene than it did from wood. Wood smoke was soft and dispersed. Kerosene was sharp and immediate, and when Maeve woke to it, she was already out of the cot before she was fully conscious of why. She crossed the loft floor and looked out the north window. The grain barn was lit up from inside, orange light filling every gap in the boards, pushing out from under the eave and up through the seams. Not the tentative light of a fire that just caught, the confident roaring light of a fire that has been burning for a few minutes and knows it's winning. She was already at the loft stairs calling Gideon's name, and he was already up, boots on, moving to the door. They came out of the house at a run and stopped. The barn was burning hard. The heat came at them across the yard in a wave. Gideon went immediately left toward the water trough, and the bucket line, a man's first instinct when a fire is still possibly containable. and Maeve went right, toward the bunkhouse to wake her brothers. She was halfway there when she saw what was on the ground. A dark pooling on the dirt, black in the firelight, too thick and too still for water. And beyond it, leading away from it toward the barn wall, a disturbance in the dirt that spoke of a struggle heel marks, the flat scuffle of a man taken down hard. She stopped. Zeke came out of the bunkhouse and ran to her. "Cormac," she said. "Where's Cormac?" Zeke turned and looked back at the bunkhouse, looked at the empty bunk, looked at her, the blood on the ground, the struggle, the drag marks beginning at the pooling and leading away toward the track, beyond the east fence, and wheel ruts in the dirt, a heavy wagon, moving fast in an unfamiliar direction, heading toward the dark bulk of the mountain passes. She stood and looked at the tracks, and the blood, and the burning barn. She looked at Zeke. "He wasn't in his bunk," Zeke said, and his voice had gone very flat and very controlled. Gideon came around the corner of the barn at a run, saw their faces, saw what they were looking at. He stopped. He looked at the pooling, at the struggle marks, at the wheel ruts heading north toward the pass. He looked up at the passes, dark against the darker sky. Then he looked at Zeke and Maeve. "Get Toby," he said, "and bring the lantern." His voice was the voice she'd heard him use when something went wrong on the drive and there was no margin for anything other than the next clear step. Steady on top, but with something hard underneath it. Toby came out of the bunkhouse in his coat, sleep still on his face, which cleared the moment he saw the fire, and then the blood. He looked at Gideon. Gideon crouched beside the wheel ruts and held the lantern low. He studied the track, the width between wheels, the depth of the press in the dirt, the pattern of the hooves. He moved the lantern to the left and found a boot print at the edge of the drag marks. Large, heel worn on the outside edge. He moved to the blood pool and looked at where it ended and where the drag began. He was reading the scene the way Maeve had learned, to read the ledger systematically, building a picture from details. "Two men," he said. "Maybe three. Wagon came in from the east track, which means they came around behind the property, not up the main road." He moved the lantern north, following the wheel ruts to the fence gap. They had the wagon waiting here. They weren't here by accident. This was planned. He stood up. "Cormac saw them," Zeke said. His voice was still controlled. "It was costing him. He saw them at the barn," Gideon said. "The kerosene was already laid when he found them." He interrupted it. He looked at the barn, which was fully burning now, the roof starting to go. They didn't expect anyone to be out here. "Cormac doesn't sleep well," Maeve said. Her own voice sounded strange to her. Too level, the way voices go when the body is managing fear by pressing it down. "He walks at night sometimes. When the coughing keeps him up." Gideon looked at the mountain passes. "They'll want distance before morning," he said. "The pass narrows about 4 miles in. Wagons have to slow there." "Then we have time," Zeke said. "Some?" He looked at Toby. "I need your eyes. Those tracks are going to be harder to follow where the rock starts. Can you do that?" Toby was already looking at the tracks, memorizing them. He looked up at Gideon and nodded once. "We ride," Gideon said. Maeve was already at the corral. Behind them, the grain barn completed its collapse in a long exhalation of sparks that rose into the Nevada night and dispersed against the cold black sky, each one a brief bright point that vanished before it could tell you anything about where it was going. The fire burned and burned and burned, and 4 people rode north into the dark of the mountain passes, following wheel ruts and a blood trail, and the necessary belief that they were not too late. Behind them, Red Ridge stood in the firelight, still standing, still holding the ground, but changed. Now, in the way that nights like this one change things. The question of whether Fletcher King would escalate had been answered. The question of what he was capable of was no longer a question. And somewhere up in the dark of the pass, Cormac Holloway was either still alive or he wasn't. And the only way to find out was to ride toward the answer regardless of what it was. So they rode. The first snow came early that year. It started around midnight. Somewhere in the second hour of their ride, beginning as the kind of fine, dry scatter that you feel on your face before you see it in the dark, and building steadily until the lantern light caught it falling in curtains that complicated everything. Gideon rode at the front and said nothing about the snow, because there was nothing useful to say about it. It was a problem. They were managing it. That was the sum of the situation. The pass road was a single wagon track cut into the side of the mountain by years of use rather than by any deliberate engineering. In good conditions, it was passable. In snow with no moon, with a lantern that threw light about 15 feet before the dark absorbed it, it was a test of a different kind. The horses didn't like it. They communicated this clearly and continuously. Gideon tracked by what the lantern showed him at the edges of the road. The wheel ruts were filling with snow, but not yet filled, they still showed as darker lines. In the pale ground, the pressed dirt holding its impression longer than the loose surface around it. He watched for them and adjusted his line when they drifted. Behind him, Toby was doing something else. He'd positioned himself to Gideon's right, slightly behind, and he was reading the terrain the way the map he'd drawn had taught. Gideon, he could read it not by the road's surface, but by the shapes of things. The rock faces, the tree lines, the way the grade changed. He'd been in these passes once briefly, 2 months ago, when Gideon had taken him to mark the upper boundary fence. Once, apparently, was enough. 3 miles in, the road bent hard right around a rock outcrop. Gideon pulled up and held the lantern out. The wheel ruts bent with the road. Then something caught his eye, a dark smear on the rock face at shoulder height. He got down from his horse and looked at it. Blood. Relatively fresh. The cold slowing the drying. Someone had put a hand on that rock steadying themselves, or being dragged past it and reaching out. Maeve looked at it from horseback and looked away. "He's alive," Gideon said. "A dead man doesn't reach for a rock face." He got back up and they moved on. The silver shaft appeared a mile further, set back into a cut in the mountainside that you'd miss entirely if you didn't know to look. Gideon knew it from a survey map he'd filed 2 years ago when he'd been considering whether the mineral rights on his upper boundary were worth anything. The shaft had been played out in the 1860s, but he'd noted its location and kept the notation. Abandoned silver shafts in Nevada were useful for exactly the kind of thing King's men had in mind. Isolated, already associated with the danger of underground work. A man found dead inside could be explained as a trespassing accident. An amateur prospector who didn't understand structural risk. The wagon was pulled off the road behind a stand of pine, poorly hidden because they hadn't expected pursuit. Gideon stopped the group 50 yards back, in the dark beyond the lantern's reach from the shaft entrance. He put the lantern down and covered it with his coat. They sat in the sudden total dark for a moment, letting their eyes find what they could. The shaft entrance was a black rectangle cut into the rock face. A single light burned inside it, faint orange-edged. The small light of a lantern turned low. 2 horses were tied to a pine at the shaft entrance. Gideon counted them. 2 horses, not 3, which meant either 2 men or 1 man was already inside. He moved close to Zeke and spoke directly in his ear below the wind. 2 horses. I count 2 men maximum, possibly 1 inside, 1 keeping watch. The watch will be near the entrance. I need you left, wide around the tree line, to the far side of the shaft. If anyone comes out the back, there's a ventilation cut on the north side. You need to be there. Zeke nodded and was gone, moving into the trees without sound, which was impressive for a man who'd grown up in coal towns and not forests. Gideon moved to Toby. He faced him directly, so Toby could read his mouth in the thin starlight. "Stay with the horses," he said slowly. "If anything comes wrong, if you hear shooting, if men come at you, you ride back down the pass and get to Tom Briggs in Cold Creek. You don't come back for us. You go to Briggs." Toby looked at him with an expression that said he understood and didn't agree with the last part. Gideon held his gaze until Toby gave him a short nod that conceded the argument without fully accepting it. He moved to Maeve. She was already checking the Winchester. He put his hand briefly on her arm, not to stop her, just a point of contact, a brief acknowledgement of what they were about to do and what it meant. "Watch the man at the entrance," he said quietly. "I'll go in." "Together," she said. The word was flat and final. He considered arguing. It took him about 1 second to decide it wasn't a productive use of the next 2 minutes. "Stay close," he said. They moved. The snow helped them, as it turned out it'd sound in a way dry ground never did, and the wind off the mountain covered the rest. They came up on the shaft entrance from the south side, using the rock face itself as cover. The man at the entrance was sitting on a crate with his back to the cold, facing the lantern inside the shaft. He had his collar up and his hat down, and the posture of someone doing a job they found unpleasant and were thinking about finishing. He had a rifle across his knees. He heard something, the horses, perhaps, or some shift in the wind, and started to turn. Gideon covered the last 10 feet at a run and took him down before the turn completed. It was quick and efficient, the practiced economy of someone who had been trained in exactly this kind of thing, and had done it enough times that the body remembered it, without requiring the mind to be fully engaged. The man went down hard against the crate and stayed down. Maeve was already past him into the shaft. Gideon followed. The shaft was low, 5.5 feet of clearance, maybe 6 in places, with rough-cut walls that had gone damp with the cold and smelled of old rock and mineral water, and something earthier that Gideon associated with places that had been abandoned long enough to start returning to themselves. The lantern was 20 feet in, set on a rock shelf. By its light, Gideon could see. The shaft opened into a small chamber at the back, a working area, where the miners had once carved out space to sort and process ore. Cormac was in the chamber. He was on his side on the rock floor, hands tied behind him, ankles bound. His face was toward them, and his eyes were open, not clearly, not fully. The eyes of a man who had been hit hard and was working back toward consciousness. There was blood from a cut above his ear, dried dark on the side of his face. His breathing was audible. One man was in the chamber with him, younger than Gideon had expected, perhaps 25, with the blank professional composure of someone who does hired work and doesn't think too hard about its nature. He had a knife. He saw them come in and process the situation very quickly, which showed some intelligence, and put the knife down without making it into a confrontation, which showed more. "Hands," Gideon said. The man put his hands up. "On the wall. Face it." He faced the wall. Maeve went past both of them and dropped to her knees beside Cormac. "Cormac," she put her hand on his shoulder. "Can you hear me?" His eyes found her face. Something in him came back toward the surface. "Maeve," he said. His voice was rough and wrong, scraped up from a long way down. "Yes," she said, "I'm here. Don't move yet." She looked at his hands, the rope on his wrists, and looked up at Gideon, who was covering the man against the wall. He tilted his head toward the knife on the ground. She picked it up and cut the rope on Cormac's wrists and then his ankles, and she rubbed his wrists between her hands to bring the blood back. "How bad?" Gideon asked, without taking his eyes off the man at the wall. "He's been hit. Head wound. It stopped bleeding. I need better light. We'll get him out first." Cormac was trying to push himself up. Maeve put a hand on his back, and he made it to sitting, then stopped and breathed. "There were 2 of them at the barn," he said, slowly, working through it. "I heard the wagon. I thought someone was coming wrong up the track. I went to look." He paused for a breath. They had kerosene. They'd already done the east side. The wall was soaked. His voice steadied incrementally. "I went for the nearest one, and the other came from behind." "You fought them," Maeve said. "I got one across the face." A brief pause. Felt his nose go. Gideon looked at the man against the wall, who had a swollen nose that was telling the same story from the other direction. "Why did they bring you up here?" Gideon asked the man at the wall. Silence. "I'm going to have a conversation with Tom Briggs in Cold Creek tomorrow morning," Gideon said. "What I tell him depends somewhat on what you tell me now. That's not a threat, it's how information works." A pause. "We were paid to make it look like an accident," the man said. Man got curious about the shaft, went in, didn't come out. They were going to find him in 2-3 days. "Who paid you?" "I don't know his name." Gideon looked at him steadily. "I don't," the man said again, and something in the way he said it had the flat quality of actual truth rather than rehearsed denial. "We were hired through a third party. A man in Carson City. I have a name for the middleman, but not the principal." "Write it down," Gideon said. "There's a paper in my left coat pocket." He crossed to the man, keeping the gun level, and the man took the paper and pencil from his pocket and wrote a name by the lantern light and handed it back. Gideon looked at it. He didn't know the name, but Calloway in Carson City likely would. "You're going to go to Cold Creek with us," Gideon said. "You and your friend, outside. You're going to tell Briggs what you told me and write the name down again." Another pause. "And if I don't?" "Then I'll tell Briggs what I know," Gideon said, "and he'll come looking for you regardless. This way you get in front of it." The man thought about this briefly and found the logic sound. "All right," he said. They got Cormac to his feet. He was unsteady, and Gideon took his left side without being asked, putting Cormac's arm over his shoulder, and they walked out of the shaft together into the cold and the snow. Outside, Zeke appeared from the north side of the shaft mouth. He looked at Cormac, and his face did something complicated that settled into relief, which on Zeke's face looked like the careful lowering of a weight he'd been carrying without acknowledgement. "He's all right," Maeve said. "Head wound." Zeke looked at his brother for a moment. Then he nodded. Cormac was sitting on the rock near the shaft entrance now, gathering himself. His face was pale under the dried blood, and his breathing was the careful, deliberate breathing of a man managing himself. But his eyes were clear, and his hands, when he pressed them against the rock to steady himself, were steady enough. He looked at Gideon. "You tracked us," he said. "Not a question understanding?" "Toby helped," Gideon said. "In the snow?" "In the snow." Cormac was quiet for a moment. He looked at the snow coming down around them, at his bound hands now free, at the man sitting against the shaft wall with his wrists tied and his nose swollen. "I left," Cormac said, "before the fire. I slipped out of the bunkhouse, and I didn't. I was going to be gone by morning." He said it flatly, stating a fact. "I'd done the accounting. My lungs, the medicine, what it was going to cost come winter. I was going to take myself off the equation." Gideon looked at him. Maeve was very still. "I was wrong," Cormac said. "I know I was wrong. I'm not asking for absolution. I'm saying I know." Gideon let a moment pass. The snow fell into it. "I'm going to tell you something," Gideon said. "And I'm only going to say it once." Cormac looked up at him. "I had 2 men under my command at the Rappahannock Crossing," Gideon said. 2 men I trusted, and who trusted me. I ordered them to hold a position while we finished the bridge structure, and they held it, and they died holding it. And for 3 years after that, I ran the accounting you just described. I ran it every night. What it cost to keep me alive and in the world versus what I was actually contributing to anything. He stopped. Cormac didn't look away. "Brotherhood means we carry the weight together," Gideon said. "All of it. The useful weight and the other kind. That's not something you get to unilaterally renegotiate because you've decided you're costing too much. That decision doesn't belong to you alone anymore." Silence, except for the wind and the snow. Cormac's jaw moved. He looked at the ground for a moment. Then back up. "All right," he said. His voice was rough, but not with injury. "Good," Gideon said. He reached down and offered his hand. Cormac took it, and Gideon pulled him to his feet, and for a moment they stood close in the cold. With the snow coming down around them, the hand grip held a beat longer than strictly required. Then Gideon stepped back and looked at their situation practically, because the situation required it. "We have 2 prisoners," he said. "Cormac needs a doctor. We have 4 miles of mountain pass between us and the valley, in snow at night." He looked at Zeke. "One of us rides ahead and gets the fire going at the house. One of us rides to Cold Creek for Briggs. The rest bring the prisoners down." "I'll ride for Briggs," Zeke said immediately. You know where his house is? I know where his office is. His house is 3 doors north. Blue door. Zeke was already at the horses. Take the prisoners' horses, Gideon said. They'll come down on foot in front of us. He looked at the 2 men. They understood the terms without having them explained. The descent was slow. The snow was coming down properly now, covering the pass road in a layer that made the footing uncertain and required attention at every step. Gideon and Maeve flanked Cormac on the descent, close enough to catch him if he stumbled, not so close as to make it feel like they doubted he could walk. He walked, slowly, deliberately, with the careful dignity of a man who had decided something about himself tonight and intended to keep it. The 2 prisoners walked ahead, saying nothing. Toby, when they rejoined him at the horses, had done exactly what he'd been told, stayed with the animals, kept them calm in the snow, kept himself positioned between them and the road below. He looked at Cormac for a long moment, reading the damage, and then he went and stood beside him and didn't touch him, just stood close enough to be there. Cormac looked at him sideways. "I'm all right," he said. Toby raised his eyebrows with an expression that communicated clearly that he would be the judge of that. Cormac almost smiled. They came down off the mountain in the early hours before dawn, emerging from the pass onto the valley floor where the snow was lighter and the sage held its dark shapes above the white ground. Red Ridge was visible from the valley road, or what remained of the grain barn was visible, a black low shape that was still faintly lit at the edges by coals that hadn't fully gone cold. Maeve looked at it for a moment. "We'll rebuild," she said, not to anyone in particular. "Before first freeze," Gideon said, "or after winter, depending on lumber." "Before," she said. "Zeke can manage the framing." Gideon looked at her. "We lost the grain. We have enough in the root cellar to see the winter through if we're careful. I inventoried it last week." She looked at the dark shape of the barn. "It's a setback. It's not a collapse." There was a difference in the word, and she'd chosen it deliberately, and they both knew it. A collapse was what had killed 14 men in Dunmore County. A collapse was the thing this family had survived and was still surviving. A burned barn was a problem with a solution. They reached the ranch house and got Cormac inside and onto the nearest chair by the stove, which Maeve had burning within 5 minutes of walking through the door. She brought water and clean cloth and cleaned the wound at his hairline with the competence of someone who had been the one in the family who dealt with injuries for a long time. "It needs a stitch," she said. "Can you do it?" "I've done worse." She went for the needle. Cormac sat still while she worked and did not complain, which was consistent with his general approach to everything. Toby sat across from him at the table, watching his brother's face with the focused attention he gave to things he was trying to memorize. Gideon was at the window, looking toward the pass. Tom Briggs arrived before dawn, riding hard, with Zeke behind him. Briggs was a thick-set man in his 50s, with the weathered face of someone who'd been doing this work in this county for 20 years and had long since stopped being surprised by much of it. He came inside, looked at Cormac, looked at the 2 prisoners Gideon had tied to the porch posts, and pulled out a notebook. He took statements from Gideon, from Maeve, from Cormac, from each of the prisoners separately. He wrote everything down in the close, careful script of someone who understood that these things went before a judge and needed to hold up. When he was done, he looked at the name on the paper Gideon had taken from the man in the shaft. "I know this man," Briggs said. "He's operated out of Carson City for 2 years. He's been hired labor for 3 different land disputes in the territory." He folded the paper and put it in his coat. "This connects to King." "The men were hired through this middleman," Gideon said. "King's the only person in this valley with a motive for arson and a kidnapping that was supposed to look like an accident. Supposed to look like suicide," Maeve said. From the stove, not turning around, Briggs looked at her, then at Cormac. "That's a serious charge," Briggs said. "Yes," Gideon said. "It is? I'll need more than a middleman's name." I have 2 letters coming from Carson City. One from a land agent named Calloway about King's water rights filings in this valley. One from you, if you follow up with the territorial recorder about his boundary claims. Briggs looked at him for a long moment. You've been building a record. I've been being careful, Gideon said. There's a difference. Briggs put the notebook away. I'll take these 2 to Cold Creek. I'll send word to Carson City. He paused at the door. Mercer, keep your people close for a while. I intend to. Briggs left with the 2 prisoners, and the light was beginning to come up in the east, gray and thin, turning the snow from blue-black to white. Gideon stood on the porch and watched Briggs ride away and looked at the burned barn in the new light. The structure was gone completely. The stone foundation was still there, which meant the rebuild had a base. It was something. Behind him, in the house, he could hear Maeve's voice low and even, and Cormac's voice responding, and Zeke saying something that made Toby's shoulders move with quiet laughter. He stood on the porch in the cold for a moment. They were all inside, all of them, alive and together in the same house, in the same light. That was the accounting that mattered. Not the barn, not the grain, not the banknote, not King and his pale eyes and his men and his middleman in Carson City. The accounting that mattered was this. 4 people had ridden up a mountain pass in a blizzard in the dark and had come back down with what they'd gone for. He went inside. The fire was going. The coffee was on. Cormac was stitched and holding his cup and looking at the table with the expression of a man who has been shown something about himself that he didn't know before tonight. Gideon sat down. Maeve put a cup in front of him without being asked. Outside, the snow kept falling on Red Ridge, quiet and indifferent, covering the burn marks and the blood and the wheel ruts and all the evidence of the night, leaving behind only the clean white fact of morning. The second blizzard came down from the north on a Wednesday and didn't stop for 4 days. Gideon had seen Nevada winters before. He knew what a serious one looked like in the weeks leading up to it, the way the sage went from silver gray to a deeper, flatter color, the way the cattle bunched at the south fence line, facing away from the ridge, the way the sky took on a particular yellow-white heaviness in the afternoons that meant the clouds were loaded and only looking for a reason. He'd put up as much hay as he could in the weeks after the barn fire, storing it in the equipment shed and the loft of the main house, and under a tarpaulin weighted with stones behind the bunkhouse. It wasn't as much as he'd wanted. It was what there was. The blizzard arrived in earnest around noon on Wednesday, and by nightfall had buried the yard to the top of the corral posts. They were cut off. Not completely. A man on horseback could still push through with effort and risk. But the supply road to Cold Creek was impassable for wagon travel, which meant no deliveries and no departures until the storm broke and the road was packed down enough to use again. This was a condition Gideon had weathered alone before. It was different now. Not easier, necessarily. Different. 5 people in 2 structures meant 5 people's worth of heat to maintain, 5 people's worth of food to stretch, 5 people's worth of decisions to make about how the available resources got used. On the first night of the blizzard, Gideon moved everyone into the main house. He didn't present it as a suggestion. He said, "The bunkhouse stove won't hold against what's coming tonight. Bring your bedding." And that was the entirety of the announcement. Zeke and Toby dragged their mattresses across the yard through knee-deep snow. Cormac walked under his own power, which was itself a kind of measurement 6 weeks since the shaft, and his head wound had healed cleanly, and the root tonic from Mary Toya, resumed and continued, had been doing its patient work on his lungs. He wasn't well in the absolute sense, but he was managing, and managing with less effort than before, and the difference showed in how he moved. The main house, with 5 people in it, was crowded. There was no way around this. Mattresses on the floor, bedding stacked in the loft corner, the kitchen table pushed to the wall to make floor space. It was the kind of proximity that could go badly. 5 people with their individual habits and needs and private sorrows, all compressed into one room, and Gideon had been prepared for friction. What he got instead was something else. Zeke took over the stove management with a thoroughness that left Gideon genuinely relieved. He understood heat the way he understood all mechanical systems as a problem of inputs, outputs, and efficiency. He kept the fire burning at the precise level required to maintain warmth without consuming their wood supply faster than necessary. A balance that Gideon had been managing by feel for years, and that Zeke managed by a combination of feel and something closer to calculation. He also located a draft problem in the east wall that had been losing heat all winter without Gideon having identified it, packed it with strips of cloth and pine pitch, and added measurably to the room's warmth within an hour. Cormac, who couldn't do the heavy outdoor work in this weather, became the indoor anchor. He mended. He sharpened tools. He read aloud from the 2 books Gideon had on the shelf, one a frontier almanac, one a collection of speeches by men he had varying opinions about, and his voice, rough as it was good for reading. It had a cadence to it. People listened without quite realizing they were listening. Toby drew continuously, which in this compressed space meant that his drawings accumulated faster than usual, spread across any flat surface with available light. He drew the room. He drew faces. He drew the storm through the window, which was a technical challenge he approached, with visible interest, how to represent moving weather, white on white, using only charcoal and a stub of pencil, and whatever brown paper could be sourced from the supply wrappings in the pantry. On the second day, Mary Toya's eldest son arrived. His name was Samuel. He was 17, and he arrived on horseback through the storm, looking like a man who had made a decision about necessity and ridden through weather rather than around it. He came to the door and knocked, and when Maeve opened it, he stood there with snow on every surface of him and said, in careful English, that his family was low on firewood, and his father had injured his hand on an axe and couldn't split what they had. Gideon looked at the storm. "How far did you come?" he asked. 4 miles, Samuel said. In that weather on horseback, Gideon took a moment to think through what that meant. "Come in," he said. "Get warm first." Samuel came in and stood by the stove with his hands out and said nothing while the snow melted off his coat. Toby looked at him with the immediate interest he brought to any new person in a room. Zeke handed him coffee without ceremony, and Samuel took it with both hands and drank it. When he was thawed enough to talk properly, Gideon asked about the family situation. Not just the firewood, the full picture. Samuel described it carefully, and in detail, the way a person describes something when they've been composing the description on a 4-mile ride and want to get it right. The Toya family had wood, but it was unsplit, a cord and a half of pine rounds stacked behind their house that Elias couldn't process with one hand. They had food, but the youngest 2 children had been sick, and Mary had been managing both the sick children and the animals and the fire mostly alone for 4 days. Gideon looked at Cormac. "I'll go," Cormac said. He was already standing. "Your lungs," Maeve said. Splitting wood is outdoor work in open air," he said. "That's better for me than dusty indoor work. And it's not a long task if Zeke comes." "I'll go," Zeke said. He put down his coffee. This was decided, apparently. Gideon looked at it for a moment and found he had no argument. What Cormac said was accurate open air. Physical work was better for him than confined spaces. And splitting wood was hard enough work that they'd want 2 pairs of arms regardless. "Take the grain sack of cornmeal from the root cellar," Maeve said. She was already at the pantry. "And the jar of rendered lard. And—" she paused, considering the extra crock of dried beans. "Maeve, that's—" Gideon started. "It's a family with 2 sick children and 4 miles between them in this house," she said. "We have enough." He stopped. She was right. They had enough. It was different from comfortable, but it was enough. And the difference between having enough and hoarding it, while neighbors struggled, was a difference she'd grown up understanding. In the coal fields, where the company controlled the food supply, and neighbors were often the only buffer between a bad month and a catastrophic one. "Take the dried herbs, too," she said. "The bundle Mary gave me. The children's illness tell her which ones are for fever." She wrapped the herbs separately and labeled them in her careful hand, drawing a simple diagram on the label that showed preparation method so Mary wouldn't have to guess. Cormac and Zeke left with Samuel and the supplies, pushing through the storm with the particular determination of people who have decided that the weather is a logistical condition, not a prohibition. Gideon stood at the window and watched them go and thought about this. He'd wintered alone twice, and alone was the accurate word. No neighbors close, no mutual aid, no real human infrastructure between himself and whatever the season decided to throw. He'd survived it. He'd been diminished by it in ways he hadn't fully recognized until this winter, when comparison made the previous ones visible. He turned from the window. Maeve was at the table, and she was doing something he hadn't seen her do before. For she'd pushed the mending aside, and she was arranging papers, smooth ones and rough ones, some from her own writing stock and some from the supply wrappings, along with a collection of things that looked like teaching materials. "What are you building?" he asked. She looked up. "School," she said simply. He looked at the papers. "We've been cut off for 2 days," she said. "The Collins children are snowed in down the valley. The Pereira family has 4 kids who haven't seen a classroom since their mother passed in June, and their father doesn't have the time to teach them himself." She set another paper down. "Toby and I were talking. If the storm holds another 2 days, and it's going to, those children are sitting in their houses with nothing constructive to occupy them. That's hard on children, and it's hard on parents who are already stretched." Gideon considered this. "The Collins place is a half-mile. Samuel can bring the message when he goes back. If parents are willing, children can come here in a blizzard." "Half a mile," she said. "They're ranch children, not parlor children." He looked at the papers. "What would you teach?" "Reading. Numbers. Some history." She paused. "Toby can teach drawing if they're interested. And sign language, the hand alphabet. It's a skill, and children learn it quickly, and it would give Toby a way to communicate with new people that doesn't require perfect hearing or voice." Gideon looked at Toby, who was at the far end of the room, and who had been listening or watching this conversation with an expression that moved through several things in quick succession before settling on something that was carefully neutral, in a way that wasn't quite neutral. Gideon walked over to him. He faced him directly, the habit of 3 months now, and said, "She wants to use your illustrations for teaching, and have you teach the hand alphabet to the valley children, if you're willing." Toby looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Maeve. Then back at Gideon. He picked up his pencil and wrote on the nearest scrap of paper. "Who would come?" "Collins children," Gideon said. "Maybe Pereira's 4, if the storm allows. Others if word gets out." Toby wrote, "They'll stare at my face." Gideon read it. He didn't look away from Toby when he answered. "Some of them will," he said. "For about 5 minutes. Children are curious, and then they're not. After 5 minutes, you'll be the person who can draw anything and teach them a secret language with their hands." He paused. "The face will become secondary." Toby considered this for a while. Then he wrote, "I'll need better paper." Gideon went to his desk and produced a full quire of writing paper he'd been saving for correspondence. He set it in front of Toby without comment. Toby looked at it. He picked up his pencil. He started drawing. Over the next hour, he produced a series of instructional illustrations, letters of the alphabet, each one accompanied by a small picture of something that started with that letter, drawn with the clean, confident line of someone who has been doing this their whole life and knows exactly what they're doing. Then numbers, each one illustrated with a corresponding group of objects. Then, on a separate sheet, the hand alphabet, each letter of the sign language system, represented by a hand position, drawn from 3 angles so the shape was unambiguous. Maeve stood beside him at one point and watched him work, and said nothing for a while, and then said, "Toby, these are extraordinary." He didn't look up immediately. When he did, he read her lips, and his expression went through that same quick sequence, the self-protective neutrality first, then something more honest underneath it. He wrote, "They're just drawings." "No," she said. "They're teaching tools. There's a difference." She picked up the hand alphabet sheet and looked at it carefully. A teacher spends years learning how to make the abstract concrete, how to take something a child can't see and show it in a way they can understand. You did that in an hour. She put the sheet down. "That's not just drawing." He looked at the sheet. He looked at her. He went back to work. The children arrived the next morning. Samuel had carried the message. 6 of them, in total 3 Collins children, ages 8, 10, and 12, and 3 of the Pereira children, ages 7, 9, and 14 materializing out of the snow, in coats and scarves, and the slightly wild-eyed energy of children who have been confined indoors for 2 days, and have been given permission to go somewhere. The main house, with 5 adults and 6 children in it, was an entirely different proposition from the main house with 5 adults. Gideon retreated to the equipment shed. He meant to stay for an hour and do some repair work on the saddle that had been needing attention. He stayed for 20 minutes before the cold drove him back inside, where he stood at the back of the room near the stove and watched what was happening with the focused attention of a man who is seeing something he hadn't anticipated. Maeve was at the table with the youngest 3, working through the letter illustrations in a sequence that was patient and specific without being slow. She corrected mistakes without making them into events. She asked questions rather than stating answers, which meant the children were doing the thinking rather than just the listening. Watching her teach was watching someone do what they were built to do. Gideon recognized it from the best men he'd commanded, the ones who could hand a skill to another person without making the person feel inadequate for needing it. It was rare. It looked effortless and was the opposite. The older children were with Toby. This was the part Gideon hadn't expected. Toby had the 3 older children, 10, 12, and 14 seated at the other end of the room, and he was teaching them the hand alphabet. He'd written the corresponding letter above each hand position illustration, and the children were copying the shapes with their own hands, checking them against his drawings, then checking them against Toby's actual hands. The 10-year-old girl made the sign for H wrong. Toby leaned over and gently adjusted her fingers into the correct position. She tried it again. He nodded. The 12-year-old boy made the sign for R, and then tried to combine it with a second letter to spell something, looking at Toby with a face that was asking a question. Toby looked at what he was trying to spell. It was the boy's own name. Toby showed him the remaining letters, one at a time, until the boy could spell his full name in sign language, which the boy did 3 times in rapid succession, with the private satisfaction of someone who has just acquired something cool. The 14-year-old girl, the eldest Pereira, Clara, watched Toby's hands with complete absorption. After about 20 minutes, she signed something to him. Not a letter, a word she'd worked out from the system she'd just learned, combining the shapes into a sequence. Toby looked at it, and his face opened into genuine surprise. Then he looked back at her and signed, "Yes." Clara grinned. She'd asked him something, and he'd answered, entirely without spoken words. And the fact of that, the success of it, the directness made her sit up straighter. Gideon watched this from the stove. He thought about Toby in the bunkhouse on the first night, standing at the window with his pencil. Thought about Toby on the depot platform in Cold Creek, drawing in the margins of a receipt, while his whole life was in transition. Thought about Toby in the mining shaft documentation he'd never shown anyone, preserving the record of what had happened because someone had to. Education, Gideon thought, had a way of revealing what was already there, rather than installing something new. What was already in Toby was considerable. It had been there all along, Under the burn scars and the careful watching and the silence that the world had sometimes mistaken for absence. What Maeve had done, what she was doing with this kitchen-turned-schoolroom, was make a space where that could be visible. Every child in the room deserved to be seen that way. The idea was stated nowhere and implied everywhere, in every question she asked, and every illustration she pointed to, and every time she asked a child to show rather than tell. Around midday, Maeve made soup. Enough for everyone, which meant she'd planned the quantities in advance, which meant she'd known how long they'd be here and what they'd need. The children ate at the big pine table. Crowded and warm and loud, with the specific loudness of children who have been given permission to talk. The Collins and Pereira children interacted with Toby with the casual ease of people who have been taught a new way of talking to someone and are enthusiastic about testing it. They signed letters at him across the table. He signed back. One of the younger Collins children signed the letter T laboriously and pointed at Toby, and Toby responded with a slow clap that made the child laugh hard. Cormac and Zeke returned from the Toya place in the early afternoon, snow-covered and with the specific satisfied fatigue of people who've done hard, useful physical work. Cormac's color was good, better than it had been before the blizzard, which was counterintuitive until you understood that he'd spent the morning working in clean, cold air rather than in a confined space. He came in and looked at 6 children at the kitchen table and 3 adults teaching and said nothing for a moment. Then he got a cup of coffee and stood beside Gideon at the back of the room and watched. "How's the Toya family?" Gideon asked. "Wood split. Elias's hand will heal. Mary's got the children better." Cormac drank his coffee. She sent something back. He reached in his coat and produced a small bundle of dried herbs and a sealed jar. "The herbs are for the lung tonic." She'd made a double batch. "The jar is preserves," she said. "Maeve would know what to do with them." Gideon looked at the bundle. "You told her about Maeve?" "We talked some while we worked." Cormac paused. "She asked about the family arrangement here. I told her," she said. He paused. Considering the translation, she said that what we're doing is what her people call something that doesn't translate well directly, but the closest meaning is something like people binding themselves to a place and to each other at the same time. She said it's considered a serious and honorable thing. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Tell Maeve that," he said. "Not me." "I will," Cormac said. Clara Pereira left in the afternoon with a copy of the hand alphabet illustration that Toby had made specifically for her to take home. She folded it twice and put it inside her coat with the care of someone preserving something valuable. And she thanked Toby with her hands, instead of her voice signing the letters THANKYOU in sequence, slowly and carefully, checking his face to see if she'd got it right. He nodded. She had. The other children went home as the afternoon light dropped, escorted in pairs by Cormac and Zeke, back to the Collins and Pereira places through the storm, which had eased to a manageable level by midday and was now producing only light snow. The house was quiet after they left. The particular quality of quiet that follows a lot of noise and activity was its own relief, and everyone in the room seemed to feel it the same way, a collective exhaling. Maeve sat down at the table and looked at the teaching papers spread across it. Toby sat across from her and looked at his illustrations. He pushed one toward her. She looked at it. It was a drawing of the room from above, a bird's-eye view of the kitchen schoolroom, accurate in its proportions, showing the table and the children and the positions of each person in it. Tiny, detailed faces, each recognizable. Maeve at the head, the children clustered. Toby at the far end, with the older 3, their hands in various positions. At the edges of the drawing, barely visible, were 2 figures standing by the stove. Gideon and Cormac, coffee cups in hand, watching. Maeve looked at the drawing for a long time. "Can I keep this?" she asked. Toby nodded. She set it carefully to the side where it wouldn't be covered or damaged. Then she looked at Toby directly. "What you did today," she said. "Teaching those children to sign. giving Clara that sheet to take home. She paused. You gave that girl a tool she'll use for the rest of her life. Every person she meets who can't hear well, or who doesn't have a voice, she'll be able to reach them, because of today. Toby looked at the table. That's not a small thing, she said. I need you to know that. He picked up his pencil. He wrote on the corner of a spare paper. She taught herself. I just drew the pictures. Maeve read it, and I just asked the questions. And Gideon just built the table. She folded her hands. Nobody does anything entirely alone, Toby. That's the point. He looked at what she'd said. He looked at the drawing of the room. He put the pencil down. That evening, with the blizzard, reduced to intermittent gusts, and the house returned to its 5-person configuration, supper was a quieter and more companionable thing than it had been in a while. The day had used everyone in a productive way, and the effect of that was visible people eating and talking with the particular ease of people who are tired from the right things. Gideon said, partway through the meal, the Pereira children, their father. He's managing alone? Since June, Maeve said. 4 children, a full cattle operation, and no help. Is he a capable rancher? From what Samuel said, yes. Gideon was quiet for a while. We should offer him access to Zeke, he said, on a rotating basis, equipment repairs and maintenance, in exchange for labor hours during spring roundup, when we'll need extra hands. Looked at him across the table, and the Toya family, he said. Elias knows this valley's water patterns better than anyone. If we're going to defend the water rights in court, that knowledge is going to be relevant. We should formalize the relationship. Something mutual. A cooperative arrangement, Maeve said. Something like that, Cormac said. That's how it was done in the coal fields before the company moved in and broke it. Families pooled resources and knowledge, shared equipment, helped each other with big seasonal tasks. His voice was even. The company hated it because it made the workers less dependent on them. Gideon looked at him. King hates it for the same reason, Maeve said. If the valley ranchers are separate and struggling individually, they're each easier to pressure. If they're operating as a network, they're harder to isolate, Gideon said. He said it simply, like a tactical observation, because that's what it was. He'd been a combat engineer. He knew about the structural difference between independent load-bearing points and connected systems. A single post under pressure will fail. A connected frame distributes the load. Zeke was nodding slowly. Stronger together, he said. Same principle as the aquifer pump. One source, multiple lines. The individual lines are vulnerable. The shared source is what you protect. Toby was drawing again. He turned his paper and showed it briefly, a quick sketch of a web, multiple points connected by lines, with a central node that was labeled in his careful hand, Red Ridge. Gideon looked at it. Then he looked at the 4 people around his table. The table he'd extended with a pine board in the first week of September because Maeve had told him plainly that her brothers were not scraps. The table that was now covered in teaching papers and herb bundles and Mary Toya's preserves and the remnants of a shared meal. He'd built Red Ridge to be a single load-bearing point, by instinct and by the habit of a man who'd learned to rely on no one because relying on people got them killed. That architecture had been failing. He could see it clearly now, in the way that you can see a thing once someone shows you the pattern. After the storm breaks, he said, I want to send letters to the Collins family and to Pereira and to the Toyas. Invite them to Red Ridge. Tell them I want to talk about a valley-wide arrangement for the spring season. A cooperative, Maeve said. A cooperative, he agreed. She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them threw a steady circle of gold. Outside, the storm moved through its last gusts against the shuttered windows. That's a good idea, Gideon, she said. He picked up his coffee. Around the table, the 5 of them settled into the evening, Cormac reading, Zeke sketching out some mechanical problem on paper, Toby drawing, Maeve with the ledger, Gideon with his letters. The stove held its heat. The house held the cold out. In the morning, the storm would be over. The road would need clearing, and the cattle would need checking, and there would be 100 tasks that had accumulated in 4 days of being cut off. There were legal letters still outstanding from Calloway in Carson City, and King was still out there somewhere in the territory doing his recalculating. But tonight the blizzard had one last quiet hour in it, and Red Ridge held its ground beneath the snow, warm and full, and connected to more than it had been before, which was the direction things needed to keep moving, which was, Gideon thought, putting his pen to the first letter, exactly the direction they would. Calloway's letter arrived on a Tuesday in late January. It came with a second document, folded inside it, a certified copy from the Territorial Recorder's Office in Carson City, 3 pages of dense official script with a seal pressed into the bottom corner. Gideon read both at the kitchen table, while the morning fire was still establishing itself, and the house was quiet enough that he could hear the paper crinkle in the cold. Calloway had found what Gideon had suspected. King's water rights claims in the valley were built on a boundary survey that had been filed in 1871 a year before Gideon had purchased Red Ridge. The survey placed the valley's primary aquifer system, including the underground formation that Zeke's pump accessed, as originating on land that King had subsequently acquired. If the survey stood, King had a legitimate legal argument that the aquifer was his resource, and that anyone drawing from it was using his property without authorization. The problem with the survey, as Calloway laid it out in his direct and practiced way, was that it was wrong. Not subtly wrong, structurally wrong. The elevation references were off. The creek boundaries didn't match any observable terrain feature that could be independently verified, and the surveyor who had filed it, a man named Abel Cross, had been employed by a company connected to King's mining operations at the time of filing a conflict of interest that had not been disclosed to the territorial office. The survey is fraudulent, Calloway wrote, without apparent drama. Whether it is prosecutably fraudulent is a matter for the territorial court, but the foundation of any water rights claim derived from it is built on sand. I would recommend obtaining the original territorial survey of this valley, the one predating Cross's filing, which would establish the actual drainage and aquifer boundaries based on observable and verified terrain data. Gideon read this twice. Then he thought about something. He got up and walked to the end of the room, where Toby kept his drawings in a flat stack under the bunk. He'd moved to a corner of the main house. He didn't go through them, they were Toby's, and not his to sort through. He waited until Toby came in from the outhouse, stamping snow off his boots, and then he faced him directly. "The terrain map you made of the north fence line," he said. "The detailed one. You marked the drainage patterns." Toby nodded. "When you did that, did you note where the water was moving underground? The seep points along the east slope?" Toby looked at him for a moment. Then he went to his stack and pulled out 2 sheets, not the original fence map, but something Gideon hadn't seen before. Larger, done on pieced-together paper in Toby's careful way. It showed the valley from an aerial perspective, the way Toby saw landscapes from above, as a pattern of relationships between things. The ridge lines, the drainage channels, the seep points along the east slope marked with small, precise notations, the creek paths. And in the center of the map, following the natural logic of the terrain, the probable path of the underground water system. Gideon looked at it. "When did you make this?" he said. Toby wrote on the corner of a spare sheet, "October. When I was doing the fence map, I saw the seep points, and I wanted to understand where the water was coming from." Gideon looked at the map again. The probable aquifer path on Toby's map did not originate on King's land. It originated under the valley floor itself, fed by snowmelt from the eastern ridge, which was territorial land belonging to no private party. King's boundary claim placed the origin point 3 miles southwest of where Toby's observation indicated it actually was. He set the map down on the table. "This is evidence," he said. Toby looked at the map, An accurate terrain observation made by an independent party before the legal dispute began, Gideon said. This directly contradicts the cross-survey's boundary claims. He paused. I need to know if there's an original territorial survey of this valley. Calloway says one exists. If it places the aquifer origin where you've marked it. He stopped. Maeve had come downstairs. She read his face and then looked at the map and then at Calloway's letter, which he pushed toward her without comment. She sat down and read it. When she finished, she said, the original territorial survey? Where would it be? The territorial recorder in Carson City has a copy, he said, but those records are also sent to county offices. There should be a copy in Cold Creek. He paused. In the town archives. Has anyone looked? I haven't, he said. I didn't know to look until now. Maeve looked at the map again, at Toby's careful notation of the seep points and the drainage logic and the probable underground path. We need to go to Cold Creek, she said. Today, he said. They went that morning, Gideon and Maeve and Toby, in the wagon with the road packed hard from the January cold. Cormac and Zeke stayed at the ranch. Gideon had told them why before he left, and Cormac had listened and looked at the map and said, if King finds out you're pulling records, he'll move faster. I know, Gideon said, which is why we go today. Cold Creek in January was a reduced version of itself. Fewer people on the main street, businesses open shorter hours, the particular quiet of a frontier town in winter, when the working pace of the land slowed and people kept themselves closer to their own fires. Tom Briggs was in his office, which was also a reduced version of itself, a single deputy present, a stove going hard in the corner. Briggs listened to what Gideon laid out. The Calloway letter, the cross-surveys problems, the possibility of an original territorial survey in the county archives. I know where the county records are kept, Briggs said. He stood up. I've been in that room twice in 12 years, which tells you how often anyone thinks about it. He looked at Toby's map, which Gideon had brought. This was made in October? October, Gideon confirmed. Before King made any formal filing, King's first formal water rights claim was filed in November. Calloway confirmed the date. Briggs looked at the map for a long moment, with the careful expression of a man who understands that what he's looking at matters. Come with me, he said. The county archives were in the basement of the same building as the Territorial Land Office, a low-ceilinged room with shelved wooden cases along every wall, files organized by year and category, in a system that was consistent enough to suggest someone had once set it up with care, and inconsistent enough to suggest that person had left and no one had fully continued their work. Briggs took a lantern. Toby took a second one. They worked through the shelves in a methodical sequence, Briggs reading the labels, Toby's eyes moving fast and accurately along the case rows. It was Toby who found it. He stopped at a case on the north wall and pointed. The label read, Territorial Survey Records, Original Field Surveys 1,000, 868 1,872. He reached in and pulled out a rolled document tied with faded string, looked at the exterior, label, and held it up. Gideon took it. He untied the string and unrolled it on the reading table in the center of the room, weighing the corners with whatever came to hand. It was a hand-drawn survey map on heavy paper, the lines precise and the notations meticulous, done by someone who had been trained properly and was doing the work correctly. The surveyor's name at the bottom was James Whitfield. The date was 1869. The aquifer origin point on Whitfield's map, marked clearly with a surveyor's notation indicating underground water source, based on surface seep observations and spring locations, sat on the valley floor itself. Territorial land, exactly where Toby's map placed it. King's Cross Survey placed the same origin point 3 miles to the southwest. The two maps, laid beside each other, told a clear story. One was an accurate original field survey by a trained surveyor with no conflict of interest. The other was a revised filing made 2 years later by a man employed by King's Associated Company, placing a crucial resource boundary in a location that benefited King's land holdings. Briggs looked at both maps for a long time. This, he said carefully, is going to require a federal marshal. Yes, Gideon said. King has land fraud and attempted manipulation of territorial records. That's federal jurisdiction. He rolled the Whitfield survey carefully and tied it. I've been in contact with Marshal Harding in Carson City since the arson. He was already planning to come out in spring. This moves his timeline. Can you telegraph him today? Gideon asked. Briggs looked at him. I can telegraph him this afternoon. Then do it this afternoon, Maeve said. She said it without any particular edge, just the direct practicality she brought to everything. And Briggs didn't appear to take offense. I'll need to retain this survey, Briggs said, indicating the Whitfield document. Keep it, Gideon said. Toby has documentation of the terrain that corroborates it independently. He looked at Toby. We'll make a formal copy of your map for the record. Toby was already seated at the reading table with paper he'd produced from inside his coat, redrawing his map in clean, careful lines with annotations that matched the Whitfield survey's notation system with an accuracy that made Briggs watch him for a moment with undisguised interest. How long has he been drawing? Briggs asked quietly. His whole life, Maeve said. Briggs watched Toby work for another moment and then went to send his telegraph. The trouble came 8 days later. King arrived on a Wednesday morning with 7 hired men and a man in a suit whom Gideon identified as a lawyer, and they came up the Red Ridge track in 2 heavy wagons, with a third following, this one carrying what appeared to be personal property boxes, furniture, equipment that suggested King's intentions extended beyond a conversation. Gideon saw them from the ridge above the house, where he'd gone early to check the upper fence line. He watched them come up the track for a long moment. Then he rode back down fast. By the time the wagons pulled into the yard, Gideon was standing on the porch with Cormac to his left and Zeke to his right. Maeve was in the house. Toby was in the barn, for reasons Gideon had discussed with him privately that morning, after they'd seen the approaching dust column from the ridge. King dismounted this time, which was different from last time, and meant something. He handed his reins to one of the hired men. The lawyer stayed on the wagon bench with a leather case across his knees. The hired men arranged themselves in a loose line behind King. They were armed, visibly and deliberately. 7 men with guns was a statement about what King thought this conversation was going to require. King looked at Gideon, then at Cormac, then at Zeke. Mercer, he said, I'd hoped to do this differently. Do what differently? Gideon said. King turned and took the leather case from the lawyer, opened it, and produced a document. He held it up without crossing the distance to the porch. Territorial eviction order, he said, filed with the Cold Creek Land Office on Monday, based on a prior water rights covering the aquifer system underlying this property. You are in violation of registered water rights, which makes your current land use unauthorized. He paused. You have until sunset to vacate the premises. Gideon looked at the document from the porch. Who signed that order? He said. Which judge? A pause. Judge Morris, Cold Creek. Morris retired in November, Gideon said. His replacement is Judge Carver, who arrived from Reno in December, and who has not, to my knowledge, signed anything related to your water rights claim. He kept his voice level. I'd like to see the signature. The lawyer shifted on the wagon bench. King kept his expression composed, but something in his posture altered by a degree. The document in his hand had become a less comfortable object to be holding. Regardless of the administrative details, King said, the water rights claim is registered and the water rights claim, Gideon said, is derived from a survey filed by a man named Abel Cross in 1871. Cross was employed at that time by a company connected to your mining operations. The Cross survey contradicts the original territorial field survey filed by James Whitfield in 1869, which places the aquifer origin point on territorial land, not on any private holding. He paused. I believe Federal Marshal Harding has received documentation of this. I believe he is currently en route from Carson City. King was very still. Furthermore, Gideon said, the forged land titles your men attempted to use in December to stage a fraudulent eviction before this one are currently in Briggs's files, along with the statements of the 2 men you hired to burn my grain barn and stage a suicide in an abandoned silver shaft. His voice had not changed its temperature through any of this. So I'll ask you again about that signature. Nobody moved. The 7 hired men were still in their line, but the line had changed quality. 7 men with guns in front of a man who isn't afraid of them is a different situation from 7 men with guns in front of a man who is, and they were adjusting to this new information about who they were looking at. King looked at his lawyer. The lawyer was looking at his case. The Valley families are expecting this to go to a federal hearing, Maeve said. She'd come out onto the porch sometime in the last 2 minutes. She was standing at Gideon's right in her coat, calm and direct. King looked at her. The Collins family, she said. The Pereira family. The Toya family. 12 other families who've been approached by your people about water rights sales in the last 6 months and who've been comparing notes since January. She paused. They all have statements ready for Marshal Harding about the pressure that was applied to them. The threats. The prices offered that weren't really offers. She looked at King steadily. A land fraud case with 1 complainant is one thing. 14 complainants is a different thing entirely. King's expression had moved through several careful rearrangements while she was talking. Zeke said, from Gideon's left, we should talk about the canyon. King looked at him. Zeke looked back with the equable expression of a man who has been thinking about a mechanical problem and would like to discuss it openly. The access road, Zeke said, indicating the track the wagons had come up. It runs through that narrow canyon section, about a 1/4 mile south. You came through it on the way in. He paused. We extended the aquifer pump line last fall. The pipe runs east from the primary pump, but there's a secondary valve on the main line that feeds back toward the canyon terrain. He glanced at Gideon. We've been planning to use that water pressure for irrigation on the south slope. The valve is in the equipment shed. It takes about 2 minutes to open fully. King looked from Zeke to Gideon. Gideon said, the canyon floor is 40 degrees of grade and solid rock underneath about 6 inches of surface. Right now, that surface is frozen. When it's not frozen, which it stops being fairly quickly when there's running water on it, he let it sit there. The wagons would be stuck, Cormac said, from the left of the porch conversationally. Those are heavy loads. Frozen mud at that grade, heavy wagons, they'd need a team and a day to get out. Maybe more. King looked at the 7 hired men. The 7 hired men were running their own quiet arithmetic. This is a bluff, King's lawyer said from the wagon bench. Gideon looked at Zeke. Zeke walked off the porch toward the equipment shed. He wasn't hurrying. He walked with the steady, purposeful pace of a man going to do a job. He disappeared into the shed. They could all hear the sound of him moving inside it, the clang of metal, the turn of something. King raised one hand. Wait, he said. Zeke reappeared in the shed doorway with his hand on a valve handle. The lawyer was standing up now on the wagon bench, looking at the canyon road behind them. The lead driver of the first heavy wagon was looking at it too, doing the grade calculation that Gideon had just done for them. King looked at Gideon. Gideon looked back. Close it, King said to Zeke. Then he turned fully to face Gideon, and the performance of it, the managed composure, the assessed angle was gone. What was left was a man who had recalculated for the last time and arrived at a number he didn't like. What do you want? King said. For now, Gideon said. I want you to turn those wagons around and take your men back down the track before it warms up and becomes a problem for everyone. He paused. And I want you in Cold Creek when Marshal Harding arrives. Don't make him come looking for you. That makes the paperwork worse. A long pause. King looked at the document in his hand. He looked at the canyon road. He looked at the lawyer. He put the document back in the case. He turned to his men. "Turn them around," he said. It took a while to get 2 heavy wagons, and a third loaded wagon turned around in a ranch yard that wasn't designed for it. There was maneuvering and backing, and the particular bad temper of draft animals being asked to do something inconvenient. The hired men were quiet and focused on the task. Nobody looked at the porch. When the last wagon went back through the yard gate and started down the track, Toby came out of the barn. He was carrying something under his arm. He walked to the porch and stood beside Maeve and watched King's column move down toward the canyon. Then he looked at Gideon and held out what he'd been carrying. It was a large sheet of paper, rolled once, edges sharp. Gideon took it and unrolled it. It was a copy of the original Whitfield survey map, reproduced from Toby's memory, with a fidelity that was almost unsettling. Every line, every notation, every boundary mark replicated in Toby's own hand, with the accuracy of someone who had looked at that map in the Cold Creek archive and retained it completely. At the bottom, in clear letters, Toby had written, reproduced from original Territorial Field Survey, J. Whitfield, 1869. Reproduction by T. Holloway, January, 1874. Gideon looked at it. "When did you make this?" he said. Toby wrote, on the corner of a paper he'd had in his pocket this morning. "After we saw the dust column from the ridge." "You knew they were coming with something legal," Maeve said. Toby wrote, "I thought they might need a copy they couldn't take away." Gideon looked at the reproduced survey in his hands. "This goes to Briggs today," he said, "and I want a copy sent directly to Marshal Harding in Carson City." He rolled it carefully and held it at his side. The wagons were moving through the canyon section now, visible between the rock walls. The frozen surface held them without trouble. It would keep holding them as long as the valve in the equipment shed stayed closed, which it would. Zeke came back from the shed and stood with his hands in his pockets and watched the canyon. "That was a bluff," he said. "Was it?" Gideon said. Zeke looked at him. "I opened the valve." Gideon looked at the canyon. "I know," he said. "I closed it again when I went in for my coat 20 minutes ago, while you were on the porch." Zeke thought about this. "So the water was running while we were talking to him," he said. "For about 15 minutes, Gideon said, which was enough time for the surface to start softening, not enough to fully compromise it. So when he turned his wagons around and went through, he got out fine," Zeke said. "Yes, but if he'd waited another hour, he'd have had a problem," Gideon said. "Which he doesn't know." Zeke was quiet for a moment. "So we didn't lie to him. We were accurate about the conditions," Gideon said. What he chose to do with that accuracy was his decision. Cormac made a sound that might have been a laugh, and then turned it into a cough, and then looked at the sky with a neutral expression. Marshal Harding arrived 4 days later, with 2 deputies and a territorial court clerk, and the settled, purposeful manner of a federal officer who has received a well-documented case file and knows what he's come to do. He went to Briggs first. Then he came to Red Ridge. He sat at the kitchen table, the extended pine table, all 5 of them around it, and he took statements, methodical and thorough, in the way of someone who has done this many times and understands that the quality of what goes on record determines what the court can do with it. When he was done with the statements, he looked at Toby's reproduced survey and at Toby's original terrain map from October, and at the Callaway letter and at the names of the middleman in Carson City and the testimony from King's 2 hired men, which Briggs had packaged and sent along. He looked at it all laid out on the table. "This is a clean case," he said. He said it without particular satisfaction, just assessment. Land fraud, filing of a fraudulent survey, extortion, conspiracy to commit murder, arson. The cross survey and the eviction order, based on it, are both void. He picked up Toby's October terrain map and looked at it for a moment. "This young man's observation documentation is going to be valuable in court." Toby was facing him and reading his lips. Harding looked at Toby directly and said, slowly and clearly, "Your map work is excellent. You may be asked to testify. Would you be willing?" Toby looked at the map. Then at Harding, he wrote on his paper. "Yes, good," Harding said. He put the map down. He looked at Gideon. "King will be arrested tomorrow morning," he said. "His counsel has already been notified to advise him to be present in Cold Creek, or we'll come to him." He paused. "The forged debts and the fraudulent eviction order are void as of now. I'll send the documentation to the Territorial Land Office and to your bank in Carson City today." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "The banknote," he said. "The condition attached to it, the water rights encumbrance King's filing created, is nullified," Harding said. "Your note stands as originally written. Nothing more." Gideon nodded once. Harding left with his clerk and his deputies. And the afternoon was very quiet after they went, the particular quiet that comes after a long, sustained tension releases. It was the kind of quiet that required a moment before anyone was ready to fill it. Cormac filled it first. He said, "I think we should eat something." Maeve went to the stove. They ate late that afternoon, all 5 of them at the table in the early winter dark, with the lamp going, and the fire going, and the food in front of them, and the conversation was ordinary, and small what needed doing tomorrow, whether the South Paddock fence needed another look, whether the spring roundup schedule should account for the Pereira family's help. Ordinary, small, and solid. The conversation of people who have weathered something and come out on the right side, and are now, without drama, getting back to the work. Outside, Red Ridge sat in its valley under the January sky, and the windmill turned steady in the cold, and the water moved in its pipes, and the aquifer, deep under the valley floor, did what it had always done, filled and flowed, and sustained the land above it without asking anything in return. It had always been there. It had just needed someone to defend it. The territorial court convened in Cold Creek on a Thursday in late February. It wasn't a grand affair. Cold Creek didn't have a proper courthouse. The proceedings took place in the meeting hall above the dry goods store, with folding chairs arranged in rows and a territorial judge named Carver presiding from behind a table borrowed from the church. The room smelled like pine resin and lamp oil and the particular close warmth of too many people in a space built for fewer. Gideon and Maeve sat in the front row. Cormac and Zeke and Toby were behind them. The Valley families filled the remaining chairs. Collins, Pereira, Toya, and 8 others who had each been approached by King's people over the past year with prices that weren't really offers and pressure that wasn't really optional. Marshall Harding presented the case with the economy of a man who had prepared it well and didn't need to dress it up. The Cross Survey, the Whitfield Survey, the comparison between them. Toby's October terrain map, which Harding held up and described in detail, while Toby sat very still in the second row, looking at his own hands. The testimony of the 2 men from the Silver Shaft, the Carson City middleman, who had accepted a reduced charge in exchange for naming his principal. The forged eviction order with its forged signature. Fletcher King sat at a table to the side with his lawyer. He was composed. He was dressed well. He looked like a man who had been in difficult rooms before and survived them. He didn't survive this one. Judge Carver took less than an hour to render his findings. Land fraud. Filing of a fraudulent survey with intent to deceive. Extortion applied to 14 Valley families. Conspiracy to commit murder based on the Silver Shaft testimony. Arson. The forged debts, Carver said, were void as of the date of filing, which meant they had never legally existed. The water rights claims derived from the Cross Survey were similarly void. Every encumbrance King had placed on Valley land through the fraudulent boundary work was struck from the territorial record, effective immediately. King was taken into custody by Harding's deputies without drama. He stood when they came for him. He looked at Gideon once across the room, a long, flat look that said nothing and meant nothing that could be used, and then he turned and walked out with the deputies at his sides. The room was quiet for a moment after he left. Then Elias Toya started clapping. He was in the back row, his injured hand still bandaged, clapping carefully with one good hand against his wrist and it spread from there without anyone deciding it should. Maeve looked straight ahead. Gideon looked at his hands in his lap, outside. Afterward, on the boardwalk in the February cold, the Valley families gathered in the loose way of people who have been through something together and don't quite want to separate yet. Mary Toya found Maeve and took both her hands without saying anything. Clara Pereira came straight to Toby and signed something to him fluid and quick, well past the hand alphabet she'd learned in the kitchen schoolhouse, and Toby signed back, and whatever passed between them made Clara press her lips together and nod firmly, like something had been confirmed. Tom Briggs stood at the edge of it all, with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who has done his piece of the work and is satisfied in a quiet way. He caught Gideon's eye and nodded once. Gideon nodded back. The drive home to Red Ridge was 2 hours in the cold, the 5 of them in the wagon, with blankets across their laps, and the Nevada sky going from gray to blue to the deep bronze of late afternoon. Nobody talked much at first. The kind of silence that follows the end of a long tension isn't empty. It's full of the space where the tension used to be, and you need a little time to figure out what to put there instead. Zeke broke it, eventually, the way Zeke broke most silences, by saying the practical thing that was hidden. Right there. The barn, he said. We should decide on the frame before the ground thaws. If we pour new footings on the east side, we can go wider than the original. Wider means more lumber, Cormac said. Wider means more storage, Zeke said. Long term, it's worth it. Gideon was listening. He had the lines in his hands, the horse moving steady on the packed road, and he was listening to this conversation happening behind him and thinking that 6 months ago he'd had nobody to have it with. Do it wider, he said. That settled it. When they reached Red Ridge, Gideon pulled the wagon up to the house, and they climbed down, and Maeve went inside to start the stove, and her brothers went to the bunkhouse to change out of their good clothes, and Gideon stood in the yard for a moment, by himself. The ranch in February looked different than it had in August. The windmill was turning. The pipelines ran east and south. The corral was in good repair, the posts solid and the rails straight. The garden had its drainage channel, buried now under snow waiting. The main house had smoke rising from the chimney because someone was inside, making it warm. He stood there and looked at it. Then he went inside. He found the deed box in his desk that evening, after supper, while Maeve was at the table with the ledger, and her brothers were in the main house, which they used freely now, nobody pretending the bunkhouse was where they spent their evenings. He put the deed box on the table and opened it. He had a land attorney in Carson City, a woman named Ruth Selden, whom Calloway had recommended, and whom Gideon had met once in November, a small, deliberate person who did not waste words. He'd written to her in January, after the confrontation in the yard, explaining what he wanted to do and asking her to prepare the paperwork. Her reply had arrived 2 weeks later with the documents enclosed and a note that said simply, "These are ready when you are." He pulled out 3 sheets of paper. Each one was a deed amendment, drawn up properly, with the relevant legal language and the signature lines. He'd read them enough times to have them close to memorized. He set them on the table. Cormac was closest. He looked down at the top sheet, at his own name written clearly in Ruth Selden's careful hand, and he went very still. "What is this?" Cormac said. "Equal partnership deeds," Gideon said. "One for each of you. I own Red Ridge outright as of today. Carver voided the encumbrances, which means the banknote returns to its original terms with no conditions attached. It's mine to partition, as I see fit." He paused. "I see fit to partition it equally among 4 partners." The room was quiet. Zeke said, "Gideon, the windmill, the pipe extension, the barn design, the grain rotation, the drainage channel." He looked at each of them in turn. "That's not hired work. That's not a season's labor in exchange for board. That's the work of people who are building something." He looked at the deeds, so they should own it. Cormac picked up the sheet with his name on it. He read it slowly. His jaw worked once. He put it down. "I can't afford to buy in," he said. None of us can. You already have, Gideon said. 6 months ago, Red Ridge was a failing operation with a bad banknote and $46 in cash and cattle that were too thin. Look at what it is now. You built that. He pushed Cormac's deed toward him. The buy-in already happened. This is just the paperwork catching up. Cormac looked at the deed for a long moment. Then he looked at Maeve. She was looking at Gideon. Her expression had gone through a few things quickly, and what was left was something honest and direct. The way her face got when she'd stopped managing herself and was just being present in whatever the moment was. Zeke picked up his deed and read it. He read it twice. The way he read things he wanted to understand completely. Then he set it down and said nothing, which for Zeke meant the thing had landed somewhere important. Toby was still holding his sheet. He read it. He looked at Gideon. His face did what it did, sometimes went through the careful neutrality first, and then dropped it. And what was under it was a 17-year-old boy who had been managing himself for a very long time and had not been expecting this particular thing. He picked up his pencil. He wrote on the corner of the nearest paper. He slid it to Gideon. It said, I can't read some of the legal words. Gideon took the deed back and read it aloud, slowly, facing Toby, stopping at each term and saying it in plain language. When he was done, Toby nodded. He wrote again, Okay, one word. Gideon looked at it. He signed his portion of each deed with the straightforward pen stroke of a man who has made a decision and is done deliberating about it. Then he passed each one to the relevant person. Cormac signed his with a steadiness that cost him something and didn't show it. Zeke signed his with the quick confidence of someone who has already done the thinking. Toby signed his in the careful, deliberate hand he used for everything he considered important. Gideon collected them. I'll send these to Selden next week, he said. She'll file them with the territorial office. He closed the box. Red Ridge has 4 owners as of tonight. Cormac stood up. He was a tall man, and the room felt it when he stood. He held out his hand across the table. Gideon took it. The handshake lasted longer than handshakes usually did. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. After her brothers went back to the bunkhouse, Maeve stayed at the table. Gideon stayed too. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals, and the lamp was low, and the room had the particular warmth of a place that has been lived in hard and cared for, and is showing both. Come outside, Gideon said. She looked at him. I want to show you something, he said. Bring your coat. She'd heard that before. She got her coat. They walked up the low rise behind the house, the same rise they'd gone to in October, the night of the first kiss and the fire and everything that came after. The snow was hard and crusty underfoot, and their breath made brief clouds in the cold air. The valley spread around them dark and wide. The Toya farm light a faint point to the east. He stopped at the flat rock at the top. She stopped beside him. The sky was clear, and the stars were out in that Nevada way, which was still not something she'd gotten used to after 6 months, and she suspected she never would. The windmill was visible below, turning slow in the night wind. The main house threw gold light under its back door. Gideon looked at the valley for a while without speaking. He did this sometimes. She'd learned to wait for it. In August, he said, I was going to lose this ranch. I know, not just to the banknote, to the shape of it. One man, one failing operation, no margin for error, and no one to catch it when I missed something. He paused. I'd been missing things for 2 years. I'd stopped being able to see what I was missing because I had nobody to show me. She didn't say anything. You showed me, he said. You and your brothers. You showed us some things too, she said. I know. He turned toward her. He was looking at her directly, the way he always looked at things he wanted to understand completely. No pretense in it, no performance. I'm not asking you because I need a second signature on a banknote. I'm not asking you because a loan condition requires a settled family. He paused. I'm asking you because Red Ridge needs a partner, and so do I. A real one. Equal. Someone I'd rather work beside and argue with, and figure things out next to than do any of it alone. He looked at the valley. then back at her. "That's you, Maeve. It's been you since Cold Creek." She looked at him. "You waited 6 months to ask me," she said. "I wanted to be sure I was asking for the right reasons. And they're the right reasons." She looked out at the valley, at the windmill, the pipelines, the barn foundation waiting for spring, at the Toya farm light, at the stars. She thought about 4 sentences and a signature, about a ticket bought with the last of the savings, about a woman who had traded desperation for something she hadn't expected, which was this exact valley, this exact cold, this man standing next to her asking her in plain words for exactly what he meant. "Yes," she said. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who'd done his accounting and arrived at a number and needed to hear it confirmed before he wrote it down. He put his hand against her face, the calloused warmth of it, and she leaned into it. And he kissed her in the cold Nevada night with the same directness he brought to everything. Below them, Red Ridge sat in the dark, still standing, still holding the ground. Only now it had 4 owners and a woman who'd just said yes on a ridge under the stars, and the accounting had never looked better. Spring came to Red Ridge the way it always did, without announcement, without the ceremony the almanac seemed to imply. One morning the ground was frozen, and the next morning there was mud at the corral gate, and the cattle moved differently, not bunched and slow, but spread out and looking for grass, and that was how you knew. Gideon and Maeve were married on a Saturday in May. It happened in the meadow above the east pasture, on a piece of land that had been brown and dry the previous August, and was now thick with new grass because the water had been running to it all winter. The Whitfield survey was filed. The cross survey was struck. The water was flowing where it had always actually flowed, underground and unhurried, not caring at all about Fletcher King or the men he'd sent. Tom Briggs brought the words. He was not ordained, but the territory was practical about these things, and he'd stood for enough marriages and enough funerals in 20 years of county service that he knew how to hold the space between them. The Collins family came. The Pereiras came. All 4 children, Clara Pereira, in the good coat she'd been saving for something worth wearing it to. The Toya family came, Elias's hand healed and both arms working, Mary carrying a cloth bundle that turned out to be food enough for 30 people because Mary Toya understood that celebrations required feeding. Cormac stood to Gideon's left. He was breathing better than he had in October, better than he had in November, better than anyone had been willing to say out loud until now. The root tonic had been a part of it. The open-air work had been a part of it. The winter of managed rest and the spring of measured exertion had been the rest. He wasn't cured. Black lung didn't cure, but he was managing it rather than the other way around. And the difference showed in how he stood. He'd also started something that spring that he hadn't told anyone about until he was sure it was working. He'd been talking to 2 young ranch hands from the Collins operation about what he knew: grazing rotation, animal health signs, humane handling methods that didn't stress the cattle and resulted in better weight and less injury. Not formal instruction, just conversation while they worked alongside him, questions and answers, demonstration and observation. The Collins boy said, one afternoon, "Cormac, you should just teach this properly." Cormac had looked at him. "There's no school for this," the boy said. "Not out here. You know things nobody else in this valley knows." Cormac had thought about that for a few days. Then he'd talk to Gideon about it. Then he'd talk to Maeve. Then he'd put up a notice in Cold Creek Simple, handwritten, no decoration, inviting any young ranch hand in the territory interested in livestock management to come to Red Ridge on the first Saturday of each month for a working instruction session. 12 people showed up the first Saturday. They worked cattle for 6 hours and asked questions the whole time, and left knowing more than they'd arrived with, which was the only measure that mattered. The second Saturday, 17 came. Zeke attended the wedding in his good shirt with grease still faintly in the creases of his knuckles, which was unavoidable, because he'd been in the machinery shed at 6 that morning and would probably be back there by evening. He'd opened the workshop in March, not a full commercial operation yet, but a dedicated space with proper tools and a workbench that ran the entire south wall of the rebuilt barn's east section. And word had gotten out in the territory, the way word always gets out about someone who is genuinely good at something, in a place where that thing is genuinely needed. The Pereira family's grain grinder had been the beginning of it. A rancher from 40 miles north had brought a seized pump mechanism in February. A freighting company out of Carson City had sent 2 men in March with a broken axle assembly and a hard deadline. Zeke had fixed the axle in 1 day, and the men had gone back to Carson City talking. And now there was a steady rotation of repair work coming through that Zeke managed alongside the ranch work with an organizational system he'd developed himself. He was building something. Gideon could see the shape of it without Zeke having said it directly. A proper workshop, trained apprentices, a regional reputation for the kind of precision mechanical work that the territory needed badly and had previously required a trip to Sacramento or Denver to find. The valley needed it. The territory needed it. Zeke was simply the person who was going to build it. Toby stood next to Clara Pereira during the ceremony. They were talking in sign language with the fluid ease of people who have been doing it long enough that it isn't a novelty anymore. It's just how they talk. Clara had gotten good, genuinely good, not beginner good over the winter, and she'd been teaching her younger siblings, and the youngest Pereira boy could now hold a basic conversation in sign. Toby had a portfolio under his arm. He had one almost everywhere now. After the court proceedings in February, after his terrain map and his reproduced Whitfield survey had been entered into the territorial record and cited specifically by Judge Carver in his findings, something had shifted in how people in the valley looked at Toby's work. Not from charity, from the actual understanding that what he could do was useful and documented and worth something in practical terms. A man from the Nevada Territorial Historical Society had written him a letter in March. He'd read about the court proceedings in the Carson City paper, which had covered the King case in some detail, and the documentation work had been mentioned specifically. He asked if Toby would be willing to correspond about the frontier historical record. He said the territory had a severe shortage of accurate visual documentation, and that Toby's approach, systematic, observational, tied to specific dates and locations, was exactly the kind of thing the historical record needed. Toby had written back a careful, considered letter in his clear hand. They'd been corresponding for 2 months. He hadn't told anyone about it until Maeve found a letter on his bunk one evening and asked, and he'd explained, writing it out on his paper in the plain factual way. He communicated everything important. She'd read it. She'd looked at him. An art studio, she'd said. He'd looked at her. You're going to need a proper space, she said, for the documentation work. And if you're going to be showing work to the Historical Society, you'll need a place that isn't the corner of the main house. He'd written, where would it go? The north side of the barn, she said. Good light from the north windows. Zeke can build it proper. Zeke had built it proper. It had north-facing windows and a flat work table and storage for paper and charcoal, and the proper drawing instruments that had been arriving by mail from Carson City since March. It wasn't large. It was correct, which was better than large. The wedding was short and warm and good. Briggs said the words. Gideon and Maeve said the ones required of them. When Briggs reached the part that required a ring, Gideon produced a plain silver band that he'd had made in Cold Creek by a woman who worked in silver and was known for clean, functional work. No filigree, no decoration, just a circle well made. Maeve looked at it. She put it on. After the ceremony, the food came out, Mary Toya's extraordinary contribution, plus what Maeve had been quietly preparing in the main house kitchen for the previous 3 days, and the meadow filled with the sound of people eating and talking in the spring sun. The children ran between the adults. Clara Pereira found Toby immediately and pulled him toward the fence line where the light was good, apparently needing to show him something she'd drawn. Cormac sat on a fence rail with a plate and talked cattle with Elias Toya for an hour. Gideon could hear the conversation from across the meadow, or the tone of it at least two men, comparing notes on what they knew, each finding the other useful. Elias knew the land. Cormac knew animals. Between them, they were working out something practical about the summer grazing rotation, and they were both engaged by it in the way that men get engaged when the conversation is about something real. Zeke had gotten into a technical discussion with the older Collins boy about a pump design, sketching something in the dirt with a stick while the Collins boy crouched beside him, looking at it with his head tilted. Two other young men had drifted over to look. Zeke didn't notice when his audience doubled. He just kept explaining. Gideon stood with Maeve at the edge of the meadow. They had food they weren't eating. They were looking at the valley. The east pasture was green, and the cattle were spread across it in the relaxed way of well-managed animals, with enough grass and water. The windmill turned. The barn stood solid and wider than the original. The new east section housing Zeke's workshop and Toby's studio. The main house sat below the ridge with its straightforward lines and its chimney and its extended pine table inside. "It's different from August," Maeve said. "Yes," he said. "Better." "Yes." She looked at the meadow, at the people in it, at her brothers, at the Valley families who had driven out for a wedding and were staying for an afternoon because that was what you did when you'd been through something together and come out on the right side. "What does Red Ridge become?" she asked. 5 years from now. 10. Gideon thought about it. He thought about Cormac's monthly instruction sessions and the 17 people who showed up last month and the note Cormac had made in the ledger about needing to plan for 25 by summer. He thought about Zeke's workshop and the axle repair and the letter from Carson City about the mining equipment that needed a full overhaul, which Zeke was already designing the tools to manage. He thought about Toby's studio and the Historical Society correspondence and the portfolio growing under consistent, careful work. He thought about the Valley families, the network they'd built over the winter, the cooperative arrangement that was already producing results in the spring roundup labor shared, equipment shared, knowledge shared, the individual load-bearing points connected into something that distributed the weight. A working ranch, he said. Cattle, water, land, all of it running right. And training ground, he said, for people who want to learn this work honestly. Cormac's already doing it. We could do it larger. He paused. And a place that means something to the valley. Not a company, not a monopoly. A place that works with the people around it instead of trying to own them. Maeve looked at the meadow. "That's a good answer," she said. He looked at her sideways. "I had time to think about it." She almost laughed. He did something he'd been doing more often lately, which was smile an actual smile, not the ghost of one, not the precursor to one that vanished before it settled. A real one, brief, but there. She'd asked him once, back in November, whether the nights were still bad. He'd been honest about it. Yes, less than before, not gone. He'd learned to live alongside it, better than he'd lived alongside it alone, which was not the same as it being over, but was something, and something was what you worked with. She'd told him about her father, what it had taken him years to put down, and what he'd finally put it down on not a grand resolution, just a Tuesday afternoon when he'd decided to plant a garden and had planted it and come inside and said, "I think I'm going to be all right." Ordinary as that. The decision coming in a quiet moment, not a dramatic one. Gideon had listened to that. She thought he was still listening to it. Tom Briggs came to find them eventually with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man about to leave, but wanting to say something first. "That was a good day," he said. "It was," Gideon said. "The valley looks different than it did last year," Briggs said. He was looking at the meadow, at the families in it. Last year half, these people were worried about whether they'd have water rights by spring, whether King was going to squeeze them out. He put his hat on. Now they're at a wedding eating good food, and their kids are running around in green grass. He looked at Gideon. You know what did that. It wasn't just me, Gideon said. No, Briggs said. That's rather the point. He shook Gideon's hand, nodded to Maeve, and walked back toward his horse. The afternoon wound down the way good afternoons do gradually, with people reluctant to end it, finding one more conversation to have, one more plate of food to accept from Mary Toya before finally submitting to the ride home. The Toya family left last. Mary pressed Maeve's hands and said something in her own language, and then in English, "We are neighbors now. Proper ones. Proper ones," Maeve agreed. The meadow was empty as the sun dropped behind the western ridge. The last of the spring light lay across the grass in long gold bars. The cattle in the east pasture were settling for the evening, the particular slow movement of animals at the end of a good day. Gideon and Maeve sat on the fence rail at the meadow's edge. Her brothers were somewhere behind them, heading back toward the house and the bunkhouse, talking among themselves about something mechanical, Zeke's voice, and then Cormac's, then a longer pause that meant Toby had written something that was making them think. Red Ridge, Maeve said. Red Ridge, he said. The windmill turned below them. The water moved in its pipes. The valley held its breath between the day's end and the dark, that particular Nevada moment of deep gold and long shadow when the land looked exactly like itself, nothing hidden, nothing performed. Just the fact of it. She leaned against his shoulder. He let her, below them. In the house, the lamp would need lighting soon. Stove would need feeding. Tomorrow there was fence work and a letter to send to Selden about the cooperative filing and Cormac's next instruction session, to plan and a reply due to the Historical Society about Toby's documentation project. Tomorrow there was all of it. Tonight there was this, the valley and the light and the windmill turning, and 4 people who had come off a stage in August, with nothing but necessity, and had built, from that unpromising start, something that held, something that was going to keep holding. The gold went out of the sky, and the first stars came through, one at a time the way they always did out here, each one arriving as if it had somewhere specific to be. Maeve watched them come. She was still learning all of them. She suspected she had years yet before she'd know them the way Gideon did, the way the Toyas did, the way people learn a sky when they've decided to stay under it. She had years. That was the whole of the thing. And it was enough. Red Ridge settled into its night sounds. The windmill, the cattle, the sage, and somewhere in the studio that Zeke had built on the north side of the barn, a lantern was burning, and Toby was at his work table drawing, documenting the day in the careful, precise way. He documented everything what had happened, who had been there, what the light had looked like, getting it right, making sure it was remembered. That was the work. All of them, doing the work they were built for, in the place they had chosen, and that had chosen them back. The stars came out fully over the valley. Red Ridge held its ground in the dark, still there, still standing. Home.